I had a strange dream the other night. It was a story explicitly labeled as fiction, but I still couldn't bring myself to put the novel down until I read every single word. As I lay collapsed on the dark, freezing floor of that basement, my body shaking violently, my own older brother turned his back on me and walked away. The very next morning, he showed up in the hospital lobby like nothing had happened, casually asking the doctor about my condition. The doctor looked at him and said just one sentence. Instantly, all the color drained from my brother's face, because several police officers had already stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. My name is Arthur, and I'm 38 years old. Until that suffocating night in California's Napa Valley, I was actually naive enough to believe that the word family meant something sacred. Before we go any further, if you've ever been betrayed by someone who was supposed to protect you, take a moment to hit that like button. Sign it. Julian slammed the thick legal document directly onto my chest. The rough parchment scraped against my shirt, but I refused to take it from his hand. We were standing in the underground tasting room of the Napa Valley estate left behind by our late grandfather. Outside, a cold, late-autumn California rain was hammering against the windows, but inside the cellar the atmosphere felt even more hostile. Julian is 41. A senior partner at a prominent commercial real estate development firm in Chicago, and the undisputed golden child of our family. He wore an expensive, custom cashmere suit and a limited-edition luxury watch that looked almost like armor. But right now, that armor was cracking. He needed me to sign away my half-ownership of the estate, a historic property worth over $6 million. He claimed he was facing a temporary cash flow issue and just needed the asset as collateral for a short-term bridge loan. But I'm a senior audit director who specializes in working for top-tier defense contractors. My entire career is built on finding anomalies in complex systems, verifying accounts, and identifying financial fraud. I know exactly what bad debt looks like. I knew my brother was drowning in massive financial liabilities. His wife, Chloe, a high-society art dealer, relied on a meticulously fabricated lifestyle of royal luxury to maintain her social status. At that very moment, she was back in Chicago, blindly running up credit cards that were undoubtedly on the verge of being frozen. I'm not throwing away grandfather's life's work just so Chloe can buy luxury handbags and modern art she doesn't even understand, I told him calmly, letting the contract slip and fall onto the rough stone floor. I didn't back down, keeping my voice rock solid. You guys have been living way beyond your means for the last 5 years, Julian. You don't get to use my inheritance to bail out your financial disaster. Julian's face twisted with panic and rage. He lunged forward, grabbing my arm, his fingers digging deep into my skin. You have no idea how much trouble I'm in, he snarled, his sophisticated facade completely vanishing. I have to secure these funds by Monday morning. If I don't get the loan, federal housing regulators are going to audit my project accounts. They'll see everything. Then you should have thought about the consequences before you treated federal grants like your personal ATM. I replied coldly, forcing his hand off me. I'm not going to liquidate family assets just because you and Chloe can't manage a basic budget. Go tell your wife it's time for her to fly commercial for once in her life. Mentioning Chloe caused Julian to completely lose his mind. He lunged again, snatched the contract off the ground, and shoved me hard against the heavy oak door of the wine cellar. You've always been a selfish, jealous jerk, he roared, his face inches from mine. You sit in your boring audit office judging us because you have no clue what it actually takes to maintain a real position in society. He spun around suddenly, walked over to the tasting table and grabbed the decanter we had used earlier. With a sudden movement, he threw the remaining liquid directly into my face. I've had a severe nut allergy since childhood. Even a microscopic trace can trigger a life-threatening anaphylactic reaction. Julian had deliberately mixed a highly concentrated walnut oil extract into that wine. Combined with the massive adrenaline surge from our physical confrontation, my immune system collapsed instantly. It felt like a thick metal band was tightening around my chest. My airway began to swell shut with terrifying speed. My knees buckled, and I dropped to the cold stone floor, desperately gasping for air, but nothing could reach my lungs. A terrible wheezing sound forced its way out of my throat. I clutched at the shirt over my chest as the edges of my vision started to blur. I needed my emergency epinephrine auto-injector. It was right inside my coat pocket, sitting in the outer room. I reached out a trembling hand, pointing toward the doorway. Julian! I choked out, my voice barely a whisper. "The medicine, please." Julian stood by the door, completely unharmed. He looked down at me, watching me desperately struggle for a single breath of life-saving air. Then, his eyes shifted to the unsigned contract in his hand. His expression shifted from blind rage to a cold, calculating, and chillingly calm demeanor. "If you're not going to help me, Arthur, then you're just a liability," he said, his voice entirely void of emotion. He didn't turn around to grab my coat, nor did he pull out his expensive smartphone to call emergency services. Instead, he knelt beside my shaking body, reached into my pants pocket, and pulled out the keys to my electric four-wheel drive vehicle. Without glancing back at me, my own brother stood up, stepped right over my trembling body, walked out of the cellar, and slammed the heavy soundproof oak door shut, locking it from the outside. Through my fading vision, blurred by involuntary tears, I heard the sound of an engine starting up outside. He drove my vehicle away into the rainy California night, leaving me alone in that underground vault to suffocate. I lay on the freezing stone floor, my chest heaving in vain. Suffocation isn't just a lack of oxygen. It feels like an entity actively tearing at your organs. Every desperate attempt to inhale felt like pulling broken glass into my airway. He was really gone. My own flesh and blood had looked into my eyes, calculated the value of my life against his financial crisis, and chosen his bank account without a second thought. For someone experiencing a severe allergic reaction, panic is an absolute death sentence. My analytical mind, highly trained from processing top-level defense data, forced the terror aside. I needed to assess my survival variables immediately. Variable A, my airway would close completely within 3 minutes. Variable B, the oak door was soundproof, making screaming pointless. Variable C, there was a small ventilation window high up on the wall, about 2 meters from the floor. Statistically, my chances of survival were microscopic, but I absolutely refused to let myself become a tragic story that Julian and Chloe could use to gain sympathy and financial benefit. I tried to stand, reaching for a nearby wine rack for support, but my legs instantly gave out. The lack of oxygen was stripping away basic muscle function. Walking normally was physically impossible. If I stayed in this cellar, my brain would give out within 10 minutes, and I would become a stepping stone for Julian's financial freedom. I had to act immediately. Dragging my body, I managed to reach the tasting table and grabbed a heavy glass decanter. I began to crawl, scraping my fingers against the rough brick, dragging my unresponsive lower body inch by inch. The lack of oxygen turned my face a deep, terrifying purple. Drag, climb, gasp. That cycle became my entire universe. I used a high stool to pull myself onto the counter, my eyes locked on that high window. It was the only exit leading out to the muddy vineyard. The physical pain in my chest was absolute torture. My lungs were screaming, desperate for air, but the swollen airway ruthlessly blocked it out. Every exhalation came with a sharp, high-pitched wheeze, providing a grim soundtrack to my desperate battle for survival. To distract myself from the overwhelming terror of suffocating, I locked my focus entirely onto anger. I pictured Chloe sitting in her luxury Chicago penthouse, recording an art appreciation podcast with a fake smile, just waiting for the phone call informing her that her brother-in-law had met an unfortunate end. I pictured Julian standing at my funeral, wearing a custom black suit paid for by my estate, wiping away fake tears while secretly calculating how fast he could liquidate my shares in the audit firm. That vivid image of them getting away with it and winning fueled me more than any adrenaline shot ever could. When you're deprived of oxygen, rage is an incredibly effective fuel. Gathering the absolute last ounce of my strength, I swung the heavy decanter and smashed it violently into the ventilation window. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the cellar. Ignoring the sharp shards, I desperately forced my body through the window and fell heavily onto the muddy ground outside. The freezing rain soaked through my clothes instantly. Mud mixed with broken glass cut into my skin as I crawled toward the county road outside the estate. 50 meters, 100 meters. My vision began to tunnel severely, and the edges of the world turned dark and blurry. Extreme oxygen deprivation was taking over, and my brain began shutting down non-essential functions to keep my heart beating. Surprisingly, the intense pain began to fade, replaced by a strange and incredibly dangerous sense of numbness. My brain deceptively whispered that it would be so much easier to just stop moving, to just close my eyes for 1 minute, To let this muddy earth become a comfortable blanket? No. I bit down hard on my own lip until I tasted rust, using that sudden jolt of sharp pain to drag my slipping consciousness back to reality. I pushed the deadly comfort away, forcing my bleeding hands to dig into the mud once more. I could not let them win. I could not let my passing become a convenient solution to his massive corporate fraud. In my mind, I visualized his financial architecture, the offshore accounts, the bank wire codes, the digital footprints he had inevitably left behind in his desperation. If I perished in this mud, that data vanished with me. I had to live long enough to show the world exactly who he was. I finally reached the gravel shoulder of the county road and collapsed heavily. There were no streetlights, just an endless expanse of darkness and cold rain. I lay on my side, my cheek pressed against the asphalt, my chest barely moving anymore. The violent gasping had stopped entirely, not because I was breathing easier, but because my failing lungs no longer had enough airflow to make a sound. The darkness closed in, swallowing the silhouettes of the trees, until only a tiny speck of awareness remained. Just as that final thread of consciousness was about to snap, a deep vibration rippled through the asphalt. A pair of bright halogen headlights cut through the darkness. A massive heavy truck, loaded with a late-night harvest of grapes, slammed on its brakes. The blinding light flooded my entire field of vision, right at the exact second my world went completely dark. When I regained consciousness, the first sensation wasn't pain, but an overwhelming artificial warmth. The steady, rhythmic ticking of a heart monitor anchored me back to reality, pulling my awareness out of the dark abyss. I forced my heavy eyelids open, fighting against the harsh fluorescent lights. My throat felt as though it had been violently scraped with broken glass and steel wool. A thick plastic oxygen mask covered my mouth and nose, forcing medicated air into my aching lungs. I tried to swallow, which instantly triggered a choking spasm, sending sharp pain through my damaged vocal cords. I wasn't at a small local clinic. The humming of sophisticated equipment and the top-tier high-tech monitors surrounding the bed told me I was in a major trauma center. Through the massive glass window of the intensive care unit, I could see the iconic San Francisco skyline. Once I had been stabilized in Napa, the medical transport team must have used a helicopter to fly me back to my primary healthcare network. My company's executive medical insurance strictly required critical care transfers to specific regional trauma facilities, a data policy model I had personally drafted last year. My career had unknowingly ensured my physical survival. The heavy glass doors slid open with a faint mechanical hiss, and a woman in deep blue scrubs and a spotless white lab coat strode into the room. Her badge read, Dr. Sterling, Chief of Toxicology and Trauma Surgery. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that immediately locked onto mine, assessing my neurological state in a fraction of a second. She didn't give me a pitying smile or talk down to me the way people usually do with patients. Her style had the kind of boardroom efficiency I highly appreciated. "You're awake," Dr. Sterling said, walking straight to the monitor beside my bed to check my vitals. "You've been in a medically induced coma for 48 hours. A night shift grape harvest truck driver almost ran over you, but thankfully he stopped just in time. Because of severe anaphylactic shock and acute respiratory failure, you were airlifted straight to San Francisco. It's a miracle you retained all your cognitive functions. Statistically speaking, the fact that you even have a pulse right now is a medical myth." I tried to speak, desperate to thank her and demand that she call the police immediately. But the only sound that came out was a wet, horrific rasping noise that sent a fresh wave of burning pain through my airway. "Don't try to use your vocal cords," Dr. Sterling ordered, immediately holding up a hand. "The swelling from the allergic reaction and the subsequent emergency intubation took a massive toll on your airway. If you force it, you'll cause permanent tissue damage. If your mind is clear and you need to communicate, I can provide a digital tablet." I gave a stiff nod. My body was battered and exhausted, but my analytical brain was running with absolute icy clarity. The burning rage that had fueled my crawl through the freezing mud had now hardened into a highly focused, lethal determination. I had to act before Julian and Chloe could control the narrative and twist my near-death experience into a tragic accident. As Dr. Sterling handed me a sanitized medical tablet and a stylus, a broad-shouldered man in a rumpled gray suit walked into the room. He flashed a silver detective's badge. "I'm Inspector Hayes," he said, his voice gravelly and serious. "I took over your case the moment Napa authorities transferred jurisdiction. They found your personal items back at the winery, but your vehicle and your brother are completely gone. We've been trying to piece together how someone with a severe nut allergy ended up nearly dying by a highway next to his own vineyard, while his brother vanished into thin air. If you can write, I need to know exactly what happened in that wine cellar. I gripped the stylus tightly. My fingers were badly swollen and trembling from peripheral nerve damage caused by the lack of oxygen, but muscle memory took over. I didn't write a tearful, emotional diary entry. I wrote a highly structured, undeniable incident report. My entire career as a senior audit director had trained me to present hard data that left absolutely zero room for misinterpretation. I tapped the stylus against the glass screen, ignoring the sharp pain in my knuckles. I typed out my statement in a clean, objective bullet point format. I detailed how Julian demanded I sign over the winery deed to cover his massive financial liabilities. I detailed how he deliberately threw the allergen into my face. Most importantly, I detailed his calculated decision to withhold my emergency medication, steal my car keys, and lock me inside that basement to die. Then, I gave them the ultimate leverage. I typed out a specific IP address along with the high-level encrypted login credentials for a private cloud server. I turned the tablet around so Inspector Hayes and Dr. Sterling could clearly see the glowing screen. Inspector Hayes read the text aloud, his eyebrows raising high. You have hidden security cameras installed inside the Napa winery? I nodded firmly, snatched the tablet back, and typed out one final paragraph. Last summer, I installed a 4K motion-activated surveillance network throughout the cellar and the tasting room for theft prevention and to monitor the vintage wine storage. The system uploads unedited audio and high-definition video directly to a secure cloud server. Pull up the footage between 8 p.m. and 9 p.m. on Thursday night. You won't just see him watch me suffocate. You'll see him step over my failing body to rifle through my pockets for my keys. Inspector Hayes's posture instantly shifted from a casual investigator to a predator catching the scent of fresh blood. He pulled out his radio and began barking sharp, direct orders to his tech department, demanding they access the IP address and lock down the video file immediately. Dr. Sterling read the tablet screen once more, her clenched jaw betraying a deep sense of disgust. She looked down at me, her eyes reflecting a new, profound professional respect. You are an incredibly smart woman, Arthur, she said softly. Before anyone else could speak, the doors to the ICU room burst open. A young triage nurse rushed in, looking incredibly frazzled, her eyes wide with panic. Dr. Sterling, she panted, clutching a clipboard tightly to her chest. I am so sorry to interrupt the police, but a major situation is rapidly escalating down in the main lobby. What kind of situation? Dr. Sterling asked, her clinical commander persona instantly locking back into place. The nurse gave me a deeply sympathetic, incredibly uncomfortable look. It's your brother, Mr. Arthur. He just showed up with his wife and a news crew. He's causing a massive scene at the front desk, acting completely distraught and hysterical. He's screaming that he's been frantically searching all over California for you for the past 2 days, and he's demanding hospital security let him up to this floor immediately to see his beloved younger brother. The sheer audacity of my brother was almost breathtaking. He wasn't just checking to see if I was dead. He had brought an audience to document his fabricated grief for Chloe's social media channels. Inspector Hayes's radio crackled with static as the first-floor security team confirmed the chaotic scene downstairs. I looked at the inspector and tapped the digital tablet aggressively with the stylus. Driven by pure, unadulterated adrenaline, my swollen fingers flew across the glass screen. I turned the tablet around so they both could read my hurried words. Do not let him come up. He just wants a photo op by a hospital bed to prove his innocence to his investors and her followers. Confront him down in the main lobby, with his cameras rolling. Give him the exact stage he wants. Dr. Sterling nodded, her expression hardening like absolute steel. She understood the assignment perfectly. I'll handle the medical update, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerously calm frequency. Inspector, you handle the legal update. Let's go deliver Mr. Julian his diagnosis. Before walking out, Inspector Hayes handed his department-issued tablet to the triage nurse, instructing her to patch into the hospital's first-floor security feed. I wanted to lie in my hospital bed and watch every single second of this confrontation play out live. As Sterling and Hayes strode out of the room, the nurse propped the heavy tablet onto my rolling tray table. The high-definition screen showed the wide, brightly lit main lobby of the trauma center. Julian was pacing anxiously near the reception desk. He was wearing a carefully styled, slightly disheveled outfit of expensive casual clothes, running his hands through his usually perfect hair to simulate an emotional breakdown. Chloe stood right beside him, holding her smartphone on a handheld stabilizer to capture his best angles. She was dabbing at her completely dry eyes with a tissue, perfectly playing the part of a heartbroken sister-in-law for her 500,000 followers. A local news team, clearly tipped off by Chloe herself for maximum exposure, had already set up heavy broadcast cameras near the automatic glass doors. Even without audio, his dramatic sweeping gestures were sickening to watch. A moment later, the hospital's IT team linked the audio feed, and the loud echoes of the lobby instantly filled my quiet hospital room. "You have to let me up right now," Julian shouted at the terrified receptionist, ensuring his voice carried perfectly to the news crew behind him. "That is my only brother. I have been searching for him frantically for 2 days. The Napa police did absolutely nothing, so I hired a private search team myself. You cannot keep me from him. I need to know if he's going to make it." "Please," Chloe wailed, turning her face directly toward her smartphone lens to make sure her followers caught the desperation. "My husband hasn't eaten or slept in 2 days. We have been worried sick. Arthur is so fragile and we just want to bring him home safely." Behind them, the heavy doors of the main elevator slid open. Dr. Sterling strode into the lobby, her spotless white coat billowing slightly behind her. Inspector Hayes followed half a step behind, his hand resting casually near his tactical belt. The crowd of patients and visitors instinctively parted for the chief of trauma surgery. "Mr. Julian?" Dr. Sterling called out, her voice cutting through the lobby's noise like a scalpel. Julian spun around violently. Recognizing her authoritative badge instantly, he lunged forward, grabbing the edge of the reception desk as if he couldn't even support his own weight. "Doctor, please," Julian begged, his voice cracking with a perfectly practiced, agonizing sob. "How is my brother? I've been looking for him for 2 straight nights. Is he going to pull through? Just tell me he's alive." Dr. Sterling didn't offer a comforting smile. She didn't lower her voice to protect his privacy either. She stood her ground, locking her eyes onto his, and delivered a devastating blow with absolute, terrifying clinical precision. "Oh, he's alive, Mr. Julian. In fact, his recovery is quite remarkable. He's in excellent spirits right now, watching a 4K high-definition surveillance feed with Inspector Hayes' colleagues." Julian's fake sob cut off instantly. His jaw dropped. The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. Chloe slowly lowered her smartphone stabilizer, her fabricated tears vanishing in a split second, replaced by pure, unmasked confusion. "The police were particularly impressed by the high-fidelity audio," Dr. Sterling continued, her voice echoing loudly in the suddenly silent lobby. "But the inspector's favorite part was the exact moment you stepped over his seizing, suffocating body, stole his car keys from his pocket, and locked the door to leave him to die." The silence in the lobby was deafening. The local news cameras were rolling at full speed, capturing every single microscopic twitch of terror on Julian's face. Chloe took a slow step backward in horror, realizing that her live stream had just broadcasted her husband's undoing directly to the internet. Julian stuttered, taking a desperate, clumsy step backward. "That's a lie. He's hallucinating from the lack of oxygen. I never touched him." Inspector Hayes stepped around Dr. Sterling, his face completely devoid of mercy. "Save your performance for a federal judge, Julian. We've already downloaded the raw video file from the cloud server. You're caught on camera clear as day, stealing his vehicle while he was on his knees begging you for his medication." Julian's fight-or-flight instinct took over completely. In a split second, he abandoned his heartbroken brother act and bolted toward the sliding glass exit. He didn't even make it 3 paces. 2 uniformed officers stepped out from an adjacent hallway, completely blocking his path. They grabbed him by the shoulders, slammed him face down against the reception desk, and forced his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs echoing through the lobby was deafening. "Julian Gallagher," the taller officer barked, pinning my brother's struggling frame against the counter. "You're under arrest for attempted murder, grand theft auto, and reckless endangerment." Julian thrashed wildly against the cold laminate counter, his face contorted in panic, while Chloe stood frozen in pure horror as her carefully constructed world shattered on a live stream. Back in my hospital bed, I watched the whole thing unfold. I leaned back against my pillows and took a deep, steady breath of oxygen. He was finally in chains, but my war against this toxic family had only just begun. The live stream on the tablet suddenly cut out as the triage nurse gently removed the device from my tray table. The sterile silence of the ICU returned, filled only by the rhythmic hiss of my oxygen mask and the steady ticking of the heart monitor. I closed my eyes, letting the adrenaline slowly drain from my battered nervous system. Watching Julian get cuffed on live television was a massive victory, a visceral validation that I had survived, but the hollow ache deep in my chest had nothing to do with my damaged airway. I knew my parents all too well. I knew exactly how their minds worked. Julian's arrest would never be viewed as the consequence of his own actions. In their eyes, it would be seen as a mess I had intentionally caused. I didn't have to wait long for my prediction to come true. Less than 2 hours after the lobby confrontation, the heavy glass doors to my room were violently thrown open. Instead of the usual mechanical hiss, the door was shoved so hard the tracking mechanism rattled. My mother, Eleanor, stormed into the room, her high heels clicking aggressively against the linoleum floor. My father, Victor, followed close behind, slamming the door shut. Their presence in the trauma ward felt completely out of place. Eleanor was dressed in her pristine tennis whites, her hair perfectly blown out, clutching a designer handbag like a shield. Victor wore tailored golf slacks and a navy blue sweater. There were no tears in their eyes. They didn't rush to my bedside to check my bandages or assess my breathing. The only thing radiating from them was pure, unadulterated fury. "Are you trying to ruin your brother's life over a misunderstanding?" Eleanor snapped, stopping just 2 feet from my bed. She didn't ask how I was feeling or if I was in pain. Her voice was a sharp, venomous hiss designed to intimidate. I stared at her through the clear plastic oxygen mask. The sheer audacity of her opening line nearly took away what little breath I had left. A misunderstanding. My own mother was reducing the fact that my brother locked me in a cellar to suffocate into a simple case of poor communication. Tapping on my digital tablet, I slowly typed out my response, my damaged fingers still aching. I turned the screen toward her. He took my medication, locked the door, and stole my car. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was attempted murder. Victor let out a loud scoff, crossing his arms over his chest. "Stop being so dramatic, Arthur." He stepped closer, towering over my bed with the same imposing posture he used to dominate corporate negotiations. "You two had a disagreement over the property. You've always been prone to hysterics whenever you don't get your way. Julian said you lost your temper and threw the wine. He panicked because he had an urgent flight to catch for a business loan. He had no idea you were having an allergic reaction. You are blowing this entirely out of proportion just to spite him." The cold detachment in my father's eyes was absolute. He had fully accepted Julian's fabricated story because it was the narrative that protected his golden child. He didn't care about the 4K surveillance footage. He didn't care that the chief of trauma surgery had confirmed the severity of my condition. All he cared about was that his perfect son was currently sitting in a holding cell. "You need to fix this right now," Eleanor commanded, stepping up to the bed rail. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger at my face. "You call that Inspector Hayes this instant. You tell him your allergic reaction caused severe oxygen deprivation and made you hallucinate what happened. Say Julian tried to help you but had to leave to find a cell signal. You must drop these ridiculous charges immediately." I glared at her, my fingers gripping the edges of the digital tablet. I typed furiously, ignoring the sharp pain in my knuckles. "I am not lying to the police to save a man who tried to end my life. The cameras caught everything. The audio is crystal clear. He told me I was a liability. He took my medicine and my keys. He left me to die. Who cares about some stupid video?" Victor raised his voice, his face flushing crimson with anger. "Do you have any idea what you are doing to this family? The local news just broadcasted Julian being arrested in the lobby. Do you know how humiliating that is? We have our annual charity gala at the Field Museum this weekend. Our friends are already calling, asking why our son was in handcuffs on television. You are making us a laughingstock in front of the entire Chicago social circle." There it was. The absolute bottom line. My near-death experience was nothing more than a social inconvenience to them. I was lying in an ICU bed, hooked up to life support, fighting for every breath, and my parents were agonizing over their reputation at a museum gala. They cared more about answering awkward questions over cocktails than the fact that their son was almost returned to them in a body bag. Eleanor leaned over the bed, dropping her voice to a harsh, threatening whisper. Listen to me, Arthur. Your brother is on the verge of closing a massive real estate merger. Chloe is finalizing a multi-million-dollar gallery representation. They have a future. You just sit in your audit office and count numbers. You don't need the family name the way they do. If you don't call the police and recant your statement right now, we will cut you off completely. We will release a public statement saying your mental health has deteriorated and that you're making these accusations out of pure jealousy. They expected me to cry. They expected the old Arthur, the son who had spent 3 decades desperately craving their approval, to break down and apologize for causing trouble. They expected me to fold, to sign whatever they wanted, and to sacrifice my reality to protect their favorite child. But as I looked at their angry, selfish faces, I felt absolutely nothing. No tears threatened to spill. No familiar knot of guilt twisted in my stomach. That freezing night in Napa Valley hadn't just damaged my vocal cords, it had severed the last remaining tie between me and these people. They weren't my parents, they were just Julian's co-conspirators. Holding my mother's gaze, I slowly reached my injured hand toward the side rail of the bed. I didn't type another word on the tablet. I didn't offer a defense or a justification. Instead, I pressed my thumb firmly onto the red emergency call button. Within seconds, the heavy glass doors swung open. A large hospital security guard and the triage nurse stepped into the room. I tapped one final sentence onto the tablet and turned the screen toward the nurse. These individuals are threatening me and causing my heart rate to spike. They are not authorized visitors. Please have security remove them permanently. Eleanor gasped, her jaw dropping in sheer disbelief as the security guard stepped forward, firmly taking Victor by the arm. "You can't do this!" she shrieked, her high society composure shattering completely. "We are your parents!" I watched with cold, silent satisfaction as security escorted them out. Victor shouted threats of disownment, while Eleanor screamed about my selfishness. As the heavy glass doors slid shut, cutting off their venomous voices, a sense of clarity washed over me like armor. My entire family had officially declared war, and I was absolutely ready to tear them down. My first step was to assess the battlefield. I picked up my personal smartphone, which a nurse had kindly plugged into the charger next to my tray table. I needed to start gathering my digital assets, lock down my corporate accounts, and coordinate a foolproof legal defense with Inspector Hayes. But before my numb thumb could even unlock the home screen, the device began to vibrate violently in my hand. It wasn't a phone call or a standard text message. It was a relentless machine gun fire of notifications, cascading down the screen faster than my eyes could follow. They were alerts from every major social media platform. Mentions, direct messages, and tags were skyrocketing by the thousands. Frowning, I tapped on the latest notification, ignoring the sting in my knuckles. The application opened, and my sister-in-law's perfectly filtered, flawless face filled the screen. Chloe was a master of the digital universe. As a highly successful socialite in the Chicago art scene, she had built an empire of over 500,000 loyal followers by monetizing a meticulously fabricated illusion of perfection. She promoted high-end art curation, luxury travel aesthetics, and the false image of a flawless marriage to a wealthy real estate executive. And right now she was using that massive platform to launch a coordinated lethal character assassination against me. The video had been posted less than an hour ago, completely bypassing traditional media to weaponize her fan base directly. She was sitting in the immaculate living room of her Chicago penthouse. The lighting was soft and cinematic. She wore an oversized cashmere sweater, and her usually immaculate hair was artfully disheveled to project the ultimate aesthetic of a woman pushed to the emotional brink. I turned up the volume, watching the performance begin. "My beautiful community," Chloe said softly into the camera, her voice trembling with manufactured grief. "I usually come here to share the joy of art and positivity with you all. But today, my family is experiencing an absolute nightmare, and I need to speak the truth before the media distorts our tragedy." She paused, reaching up a perfectly manicured hand to brush away a well-timed tear. "Many of you have already seen the horrifying local news footage of my husband Julian being detained at a hospital. What the news isn't telling you is the heartbreaking reality we deal with behind closed doors. My brother-in-law, Arthur, has been battling a severe addiction to prescription medication for years. We have tried everything to help him. We offered to pay for luxury rehabilitation centers. We staged interventions. We have given him nothing but love and support." I clenched my jaw, my teeth aching. She wasn't just lying, she was weaponizing the language of mental health and addiction to completely systematically destroy my credibility. Chloe looked directly into the camera, her expression shifting to one of deep, tragic pity. Arthur was suffering from severe drug-induced hallucinations at our family vineyard in Napa Valley this weekend. He became incredibly violent, stole several items from the estate, and ran out into the rainy night in a state of complete psychosis. My husband risked his own life, searching through the mud for him all night long. When Arthur was finally rescued by a truck driver and rushed to the hospital, we thought our prayers had been answered. We flew to his side immediately. She let out a heartbreaking, cinematic sob, covering her mouth as if crushed by the weight of the betrayal. But instead of accepting the psychiatric help he so desperately needs, Arthur is using this tragedy to blackmail us. He's demanding we hand over family assets to fund his addiction. He even filed completely fabricated, malicious reports with the police to force our hand. Addiction is a terrible disease. It turns the people you love into monsters who will do anything for their next fix. We have decided to set strict boundaries to protect our family, but we are absolutely heartbroken. Please keep Julian in your prayers while we work to clear his name. The video ended. I stared at the screen, my analytical brain instantly dissecting the sheer brilliance of her strategy. It was a masterclass in digital warfare. By framing me as an unstable addict suffering from delusions, Chloe provided a convenient, socially acceptable explanation for why I was found in the mud. She transformed Julian from a cold-blooded criminal into a tragic, self-sacrificing hero dealing with a toxic relative. Best of all, she preemptively discredited any evidence I could present, painting the surveillance footage and police reports as the malicious fabrications of an addict trying to extort money. I looked at the metrics below the video. It already had 300,000 views and was climbing exponentially with every refresh. The comment section was an absolute slaughterhouse. Chloe had built a following that functioned like a loyal army, and she had just pointed them directly at me. Other influencers and micro-celebrities were leaving heart emojis, offering unconditional support to Chloe and Julian, praising her courage for setting boundaries with a toxic family member. In the court of public opinion, the narrative had been successfully hijacked and completely inverted. Then, the digital assault escalated from a public smear campaign to a targeted personal attack. Somehow, whether through Chloe's deliberate leak or the relentless digging of her rabid followers, my personal phone number and private social media accounts were broadcasted to the mob. My phone screen lit up, freezing for a full second under the sheer volume of incoming data. The notifications became an endless rolling waterfall of digital venom. Direct messages flooded my inboxes. Texts from unknown numbers bombarded my screen. "You're a disgusting addict. How dare you try to ruin an innocent man's life just to fund your habit? You should have died in that cellar. I hope the police lock you away in a psych ward forever." The device grew hot in my hand as hundreds of hateful messages poured in every minute. Strangers from across the country, people who knew absolutely nothing about me or the truth of that night in Napa Valley, were actively wishing for my demise. The viral mob was relentless, blind, and terrifyingly efficient. Trapped in a hospital bed with a battered body, I was completely isolated under the crushing weight of a nationwide smear campaign. The torrent of hatred continued to explode across my screen, burying me in a new kind of storm. The device vibrated so violently it nearly slipped from my heavily bandaged fingers. I went straight into the settings menu and forced a shutdown on every single social media alert. A sudden digital silence fell over my room, but the damage had already accelerated beyond my control. As a senior audit director for a major defense contractor, the foundation of my entire professional survival rested on absolute data integrity, ironclad security clearances, and unshakable trust. I managed systems that scrutinized top-secret defense budget allocations and oversaw sensitive military supply chain compliance frameworks across the country. If the public believed I was an unstable addict operating on the edge of psychosis, my career was effectively over. My phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't a hate message from one of Chloe's followers. The caller ID displayed Marcus, the CEO of my firm. Marcus was a cold, pragmatic numbers man who had personally recruited me to completely restructure our company's compliance architecture. I slid the green icon and held the device to my ear, bracing for the impact. Arthur, tell me you're safe and recovering, Marcus said, his voice tight, stripped of his usual confident corporate swagger. I'm in the ICU, Marcus. I survived, I replied, my voice still a harsh, painful rasp due to my damaged airway. I saw the local news reports about Julian's arrest in the hospital lobby, Marcus continued, his tone shifting quickly to cautious corporate diplomacy. And then the board forwarded me the video your sister-in-law posted online. It's already sitting at over 2 million views and trending nationwide. I closed my eyes, leaning my head against the stiff hospital pillow. Marcus, every single word in that video is a calculated lie designed to cover up an attempted murder. I am not an addict. I was physically assaulted and left to die. I want to believe you, Arthur. Personally, I really do. Marcus let out a heavy sigh. But professionally, my hands are completely tied. Our firm handles highly classified defense budget records for the Pentagon. Your specific department audits the supply chain tracking and financial compliance of advanced weapons systems. The board called an emergency meeting 20 minutes ago. 3 of our largest Department of Defense clients have already called legal, threatening to pull hundreds of millions of dollars in contracts. They absolutely cannot have a chief audit director with a top-secret clearance trending nationally under accusations of severe drug addiction and mental instability. The air seemed to drain from the room once again. You're suspending me? Yes, Marcus confirmed, his voice laced with a regret that was ultimately useless to my survival. You've been placed on unpaid administrative leave pending a full corporate investigation and the complete resolution of these legal matters. Your corporate access has been revoked. Your company laptop and secure servers have been locked out. I'm incredibly sorry, Arthur. Get well, clear your name, and then we'll talk about bringing you back. The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone to my lap. In less than 72 hours, Julian and Chloe had systematically stripped away everything. My brother had taken my physical safety and tried to steal my inheritance. My parents had taken my family foundation by actively protecting the man who tried to end my life. And now Chloe had taken my reputation, my income, and my daily professional purpose. I was completely cut off from the career I had spent a decade building from scratch. An hour later, Dr. Sterling walked into the room with a thick stack of discharge papers. My blood oxygen levels had finally stabilized enough for outpatient recovery, even though my throat remained raspy and my hands were still heavily bandaged from the rough brick masonry. A hospital social worker followed close behind, dropping off a clear plastic bag containing the few personal items recovered from my muddy coat pockets. Every muscle in my body screaming in violent protest. The massive, blossoming purple bruises across my ribs and hips were painful reminders of my hard fall onto broken glass and solid earth. Since my own clothes had been cut away during my emergency trauma admission, I was forced to change into a standard set of gray hospital sweats provided by the staff. The rough fabric chafed against my scraped skin, but I grit my teeth and forced myself to dress independently. Standing in front of the small bathroom mirror, I stared critically at my reflection. I looked physically ruined. My skin was pale and hollow, my lips cracked and bleeding. I had no job to go back to on Monday morning. I had no family to call for a ride home. I had an army of internet strangers actively praying for my downfall. Yet, as I walked back to the bedside and signed the final discharge papers with my injured hand, I didn't shed a single tear. The panic was entirely gone. That lingering childhood obsession with craving my parents' approval had completely evaporated in the sterile hospital air. Chloe thought she had won the war by controlling the social media narrative with fake tears. Julian thought he could hide behind his high-priced defense attorneys and our parents' upper-class Chicago influence. They had made a fatal miscalculation. They assumed I would react like a broken, helpless victim. They forgot that my job is to deconstruct the most complex financial structures. I find the hidden vulnerabilities. I trace the anomalies. I expose the truth with unyielding metrics. I stepped out through the hospital's sliding doors into the cool, crisp San Francisco breeze. My body was battered, and I was officially stripped of my daily life. But my analytical mind was now operating with an ice-cold clarity. I called a rideshare vehicle to the hospital curb, sliding into the quiet, odorless backseat of the sedan. The driver didn't ask questions about my oversized gray hospital sweats or the thick white bandages wrapping my hands, for which I was deeply grateful. As we navigated the congested streets of the Bay Area, I rigidly compartmentalized my immediate tasks to block out the physical pain. Step 1 was securing my physical environment. I had a fireproof safe in my home office containing encrypted backup drives, hardware ledgers, and emergency cash. Step 2 was initiating a total financial lockdown on all my personal accounts before my parents could attempt any further manipulation. The vehicle pulled up to my modern high-rise apartment building in Chicago's Gold Coast. I thanked the driver, walked through the lobby, and took the elevator to the penthouse. This property was my sanctuary. It was paid off entirely with a lump sum corporate bonus I had earned 3 years ago for designing a predictive defense audit model. It was the one place the tentacles of my toxic family had never been allowed to reach. I had intentionally engineered my life to be an independent fortress. I walked up to my door, extending my injured index finger toward the biometric smart lock on the heavy security door. I pressed my thumb against the glass sensor. A sharp double beep emitted, and the LED indicator flashed a bright, solid red. Access denied. Frowning, I wiped a speck of dust off the sensor, assuming a smudge or my damaged skin was interfering with the optical reading. I shifted my hand to the keypad, entering my highly classified 6-digit master passcode. The harsh double beep echoed in the hallway once again. The red light flashed a second time. The master passcode had been completely wiped from the system's firmware. A cold rush of adrenaline surged through my veins, briefly overriding the dull ache in my ribs. Reaching into the plastic bag of hospital belongings, I pulled out my physical backup key. I slid the metal into the mechanical override cylinder beneath the keypad. It wouldn't turn. I pulled the key out, inspecting the lock mechanism closely. The brass cylinder was completely different from the one I had installed. Looking down, I noticed a fresh scattering of tiny metal shavings on the doormat. The entire lock had been drilled out and replaced with professional tools within the last 24 hours. Before I could even process the sheer illegality of someone changing the locks on my primary residence, the video intercom screen on the door flashed to life. The interior hallway lights flooded the entryway, and through the frosted glass panel beside the door, silhouettes came into focus. Standing safely inside my home, protected by thick reinforced glass, were my brother and sister-in-law. Julian wasn't wearing Orange County jail scrubs. He was dressed in a spotless dark gray luxury tracksuit, casually holding a mug of coffee brewed from my own expensive imported beans. Our parents had moved with lightning speed, leveraging their massive wealth and high-priced defense attorneys to post an astronomical bail for an attempted murder charge. Getting their golden child out of a holding cell had taken priority over checking if I was even breathing on my own. Standing right beside him was Chloe. She was no longer wearing the oversized cashmere sweater she had used to wipe away her tears in the smear video. Instead, she wore a sleek designer jumpsuit, her hair slicked back into a tight, perfect bun. She held her smartphone loosely in one hand, the screen completely dark. She didn't need to perform for an audience right now. The mask of the grieving influencer had been completely stripped away, revealing the greedy, calculating opportunist underneath. I stared at them through the glass, my chest tightening. They had broken into my home. They had invaded my only safe haven. I stepped forward and slammed my fist against the heavy door, completely ignoring the sharp pain radiating through my damaged knuckles. "Get out of my house," I shouted, my voice raspy but echoing loudly in the quiet hallway. "You are trespassing. I'm calling the police right now." Julian didn't even blink. He took a slow, arrogant sip of his coffee and smiled. It was a hollow, dead smirk that sent a wave of absolute revulsion through my stomach. He casually gestured for Chloe to step forward. Chloe walked right up to the glass. She didn't make a move to unlock the door or let me in. Instead, she knelt near the thick weather stripping at the bottom of the threshold. She slid a thick, folded manila envelope through the narrow metal gap beneath the door. The envelope dropped onto my doormat with a soft thud. I looked down at the envelope, then back up at their smug faces. Forcing my aching ribs to cooperate, I slowly crouched down and picked up the heavy paper package. My bandaged fingers tore open the seal. Inside were several pages of dense, highly structured legal documents printed on the thick premium paper favored by top-tier corporate firms. I scanned the bold black text at the top of the very first page. Emergency petition for temporary adult guardianship. Attached beneath it was another equally chilling legal document. Temporary medical power of attorney. My analytical mind instantly decoded the devastating legal trap they had just laid out. They had weaponized my emergency trauma admission records. By leveraging my oxygen deprivation, my airway edema, and their entirely fabricated narrative about my mental breakdown, they had filed an emergency, ex parte petition in family court. Using Chloe's viral video and my parents' massive financial resources, they had convinced a judge that I was currently a danger to myself. They were taking a legal framework designed to protect vulnerable patients and using it as a weapon to strip away my personal autonomy and financial independence. By establishing temporary medical power of attorney and pending guardianship, Julian now had the legal presumption of authority to occupy my residence, access my bank accounts, and make binding decisions on my behalf. They weren't just trying to steal the Napa Valley winery anymore. They were executing a hostile corporate takeover of my entire life. They desperately needed control of my defense contractor stock options and liquid assets to plug the massive financial holes in Julian's accounts before federal authorities caught on to his fraud. I looked up from the terrifying legal documents, a fresh, unquenchable rage burning hot in my chest. I walked straight up to the glass, bringing my face inches from Chloe's. Chloe leaned in on the other side, her perfectly lined lips curling into a wicked, triumphant smile. Her voice carried clearly through the thick glass of the door, dripping with absolute malice. "You're legally incapacitated, Arthur," Chloe sneered through the glass. "We're taking over your assets to help with your recovery." I stared at her contoured face, looking at the pure, malicious joy in her eyes. 5 years ago, the old version of me would have screamed until my vocal cords bled. I would have smashed my fists against the glass, begging for my home back, playing right into their hands and providing the exact hysterical reaction needed for any passing patrol car to validate their lies. But I didn't. I just turned around and walked away. I strode down the hallway without looking back. Reaching into the hidden lining of my trousers, I pulled out my encrypted emergency titanium flash drive and a stack of $100 bills that I always kept vacuum sealed for the absolute worst-case scenario. Working in cybersecurity and defense data compliance had taught me to always be prepared for a systemic collapse. And today, the system that collapsed was my own family. I flagged down a city taxi at the corner, handed the driver a crisp $100 bill, and instructed him to drive to the Langham Crest. It was a fortress of a hotel that catered to visiting tech executives and foreign dignitaries, featuring fully automated elevator protocols and highly restricted floor access. Using a corporate alias I kept for security audits, I prepaid a week's stay entirely in cash. The suite was spacious, sterile, and absolutely quiet. I locked the heavy deadbolt, engaged the secondary security latch, and peeled off the rough gray hospital sweats. After taking a scalpel-hot shower that sent waves of stings across my bruised ribs, I wrapped myself in a thick terry cloth robe. I sat down at the heavy mahogany desk, switched on the ambient desk lamp, and spread the legal documents across the polished wood. I needed to dissect their trap. The emergency petition was a masterpiece of legal loophole manipulation. My parents had clearly spared no expense. They had hired a top-tier firm known for malicious corporate takeovers, essentially treating my life like a hostile business acquisition. But the foundation of their entire petition relied heavily on a single medical affidavit. My injured finger traced down the page to the signature line. Dr. Silas Vance. A quick search on the tablet in my hotel room confirmed my suspicions. Vance was an incredibly high-priced, repeatedly sanctioned private psychiatrist who catered exclusively to the ultra-wealthy. He was essentially a legal assassin in a white coat, making a lucrative living by rubber-stamping competency assessments for wealthy families who wanted to silence inconvenient heirs or seize control of trust funds. Vance had signed a sworn statement declaring that I was suffering from severe self-destructive tendencies due to acute substance withdrawal and post-traumatic psychosis following the Napa Valley incident. He had never even spoken a single word to me. His diagnosis was based entirely on Chloe's viral video and a heavily doctored hospital admission summary that my parents had likely bribed a rogue administrator to provide. The American legal system has a terrifying blind spot when it comes to ex parte guardianship hearings. A judge can temporarily strip away your basic civil liberties without you even being present in the courtroom, provided the medical affidavits look legitimate. Once you are locked into that system, escaping is a bureaucratic nightmare. You lose the right to hire your own counsel, the right to spend your own money, and even the right to refuse forced medical treatment. My family was attempting to bury me alive legally. The sheer audacity of the manipulation was staggering, but my analytical mind locked onto the data. Why go to such extreme lengths? Why risk federal fraud to lock me into a guardianship? I flipped to the asset schedule attached to the petition. Julian had listed himself as the primary trustee conservator. If the judge granted the final order next week, Julian would gain unilateral, unchecked access to my corporate stock options, my real estate portfolio, and my liquid offshore capital. Julian wasn't just greedy, he was a drowning animal. As a senior partner at a major commercial development firm in Chicago, my brother lived a lifestyle that far exceeded his legitimate compensation. Chloe's high society facade required horrifying overhead, private jets, couture wardrobes, luxury rentals, all of which cost a fortune. I knew my brother's salary, and it absolutely could not support the millions they burned through annually. Julian was drowning in hidden debt, likely margin calls or embezzled project funds that were about to be audited. He desperately needed a massive, untraceable injection of cash, and grandfather's winery was just the appetizer. When I refused to sign over the Napa Valley property in that tasting room, he realized he needed the whole treasury. He left me in that basement to die so he could inherit it all. When the truck driver ruined his murder plan, my parents scrambled to execute Plan B. They were going to lock me in a psychiatric facility, declare me legally incompetent, and let Julian bleed my accounts dry to save him from a federal prison sentence. They chose to sacrifice my freedom and sanity to protect their favorite child from the consequences of his own financial crimes. They had backed me into a corner in both the physical and legal worlds. They had locked me out of my own home, frozen my traditional bank accounts, and turned the public against me. But they fundamentally misunderstood the battlefield. They thought power resided in upper-class social circles, viral tears on social media, and forged legal signatures. They didn't understand that in the modern world, true power resides entirely in data. I reached into my bag and pulled out the encrypted titanium flash drive. I walked over to the high-end smart television mounted on the wall, bypassed the hotel's network, and booted a secure, untraceable operating system directly from my drive. The screen flickered, shifting from the hotel welcome menu to a cold, black command terminal. Bypassing standard firewalls, I established a secure tunnel straight into my firm's hidden backup servers. My swollen, bandaged fingers hovered above the glass keyboard. I had spent a lifetime trying to be a good son, trying to win the affection of parents who only saw me as a spare parts warehouse for their favorite child. That version of Arthur had died in that freezing wine cellar in Napa Valley. The man sitting in this hotel room was a premier data architect who held the digital keys to global financial systems. I opened my secure laptop. It was time to stop surviving the hunt and start leading it. My fingers flew across the keys, ignoring the pain. The sterile silence of the hotel room stood in stark contrast to the life-or-death crisis I had just narrowly escaped, and the legal storm currently raging around me. But in this digital realm, I was the one in absolute control. My first target was Julian. I needed to understand the exact shape and scope of his desperation. He was a senior partner at Apex Realty, a mid-sized but hyper-aggressive development firm. His official salary was handsome, but it was absolutely impossible for it to support the lavish lifestyle Chloe constantly flaunted on social media. I started by pulling Apex Realty's public regulatory filings. I wrote a quick Python script to scrape their quarterly financial statements, cross-referencing their declared assets under management against the specific projects Julian personally spearheaded. The numbers were dense, intentionally obscured by layers of complex commercial jargon, but to me they were just data points waiting to be organized. I built a dynamic dashboard plotting the performance metrics of Julian's portfolio over the past 5 years. The initial trend line was stable, but approximately 18 months ago it became wildly volatile. There were sharp, unexplained capital drawdowns followed by sudden, aggressive account backfills. It didn't look like strategic investment, it looked like high-stakes gambling. Next, I turned my attention to Chloe's digital footprint. I didn't even need to hack into her private accounts. She broadcasted her life to 500,000 followers every single day. Using an image recognition API, I scanned her Instagram and TikTok feeds, cataloging every designer handbag, every first-class flight to Dubai or Paris, and every piece of custom jewelry. I built a secondary dataset, assigning estimated retail values to each item. The results were staggering. Chloe's documented expenditures over the past 18 months exceeded Julian's total estimated salary by a factor of 3, even accounting for her influencer sponsorships, which I analyzed by tracking engagement metrics and standard industry conversion rates. The math didn't add up. They were burning through millions of dollars they legally did not have. I needed to find the bridge between Julian's erratic project accounts and Chloe's astronomical spending. I dove deep into the murky waters of shell companies and offshore entities. Using specific search protocols, I scanned the public registries of Delaware, Nevada, and Wyoming, states notorious for corporate anonymity. I searched for variations of Julian's name, Chloe's maiden name, and even the names of their childhood pets. Hours bled into the deep night. The hotel room remained dead quiet, save for the rapid clacking of my keyboard. My eyes ached, but the thrill of the hunt kept me locked in. Finally, I hit a nerve. A Delaware LLC named Aegis Holdings had been registered exactly 2 weeks before the first major capital drawdown from one of Julian's government-funded development projects. The registered agent was a notoriously shady law firm, but the digital breadcrumbs eventually led me to a secondary filing in Cyprus. Bypassing a weak firewall on the Cypriot corporate registry database by leveraging an outdated security protocol I had flagged during a vulnerability audit 3 years ago, the documents loaded. Aegis Holdings was the umbrella entity for a network of offshore bank accounts. I ran a cross-reference algorithm matching the dates of Julian's large withdrawals from Apex Realty projects to the exact dates of deposits into the Aegis Holdings accounts. The correlation was undeniable. The data points aligned perfectly, the digital fingerprints of a massive financial fraud. Julian wasn't just losing money on bad investments. He was actively stealing federal urban development grants, laundering the cash through Aegis Holdings, and using it to fund Chloe's socialite lifestyle. The cash flow issue he had screamed about in the wine cellar wasn't a temporary market dip. It was a desperate struggle to replace the missing funds before a quarterly audit caught up to him. The scale of the embezzlement was breathtaking. My brother wasn't just a greedy, desperate man. He was a mastermind running a highly sophisticated Ponzi scheme, and he had been willing to end my life to keep it hidden. I leaned back in the ergonomic hotel chair, staring at the glowing data model on my screen. The numbers painted a picture of absolute ruin for Julian and Chloe. But I needed one final piece: the smoking gun that directly tied the stolen money back to their personal accounts. I ran a final query targeting bank transactions associated with Chloe's primary gallery business, Chloe Art Advisory. The progress bar crawled across the screen as the algorithm sifted through millions of data packets. My heart beat a steady adrenaline-fueled rhythm against my bruised ribs. The query completed, and the screen populated with detailed transaction logs. I scrolled down, my eyes darting across the rows of data. There it was. A massive recurring wire transfer coming directly from the accounts tied to Aegis Holdings straight into Chloe's primary business checking account. The memo line read, "High net worth art appraisal and advisory fees." I had hit the jackpot. The discrepancy on the books wasn't a simple rounding error. It was a massive $4.5 million black hole in Julian's development portfolio, a hole he had tried to fill using my inheritance and my life. The hard evidence was right there, glowing brightly on my monitor, waiting to be unleashed. I stared at the transaction logs, the harsh blue light of the display reflecting in my tired eyes. $4.5 million. This wasn't a crime of panic. This was a systematic, calculated drainage of federal funds, executed with frightening precision over 18 months. My fingers hovered over the keyboard as I dug deeper into the architecture of his fraud. Julian hadn't just embezzled from his development firm. He had targeted specific federal grants within Apex Realty meant for low-income housing developments, projects where regulators placed massive trust in him and rarely scrutinized the digital portals. Under the guise of high-yield offshore material procurement, he routed the federal cash into Aegis Holdings. From there, the money was washed through Cyprus and wired directly into Chloe's gallery business. Chloe was far from an innocent beneficiary of her husband's crimes. She was the primary launderer. Her high-end art brand was the perfect cover. By claiming the stolen millions as consulting fees and premium art sales, she integrated the dirty cash into the legitimate banking system. Every designer bag she flaunted, every luxury vacation she vlogged, and every high-end dinner she posted was paid for by stolen federal infrastructure funds. They were a modern-day criminal enterprise operating under the perfect filter of social media glamour. But a financial fraud of this magnitude always comes with a countdown. I pulled up the public audit calendar for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. There it was. The mandatory annual third-party audit for Apex Realty's projects was scheduled to begin next Monday morning. The entire timeline snapped together with chilling clarity. The trouble Julian was panicking about in the wine cellar had nothing to do with market shifts. He was staring down a massive, unavoidable federal audit that would instantly expose the missing $4.5 million. He needed clean, immediate cash to replace the stolen funds before the auditors arrived. That was why he needed our grandfather's winery. He needed a multi-million-dollar, unencumbered asset to secure a fast bridge loan from a private lender. When I refused him that rainy night in the cellar, I wasn't just denying him money, I was effectively signing his federal prison warrant. The realization sent a fresh chill down my spine. Julian stepping over my seizing body hadn't been a moment of panicked hesitation. It was a cold, calculated shift in his criminal strategy. If I died in that basement, he would automatically inherit my entire estate, including my defense firm stock options and the other half of the winery. My death was the ultimate financial bailout for his embezzlement scheme. He was willing to watch his own brother suffocate to stop auditors from discovering his white-collar crimes. And my parents were actively assisting him by filing for emergency guardianship to declare me mentally incompetent. They were trying to seize my assets to save him, perfectly willing to destroy my freedom and sanity to protect their golden child. I leaned back against the hotel chair, my bruised ribs protesting the movement. The sheer scale of their betrayal was staggering, but I couldn't afford the luxury of emotional devastation. I had to weaponize this data. Opening a new, highly encrypted folder on my secure desktop, I began compiling the digital dossier. I didn't just save the raw data, I organized it meticulously, exactly how a prosecutor would prepare exhibits for a grand jury. I created a master spreadsheet tracking the flow of every single dollar, from the exact moment it left the Apex Realty accounts to the precise second it landed in Chloe's business checking account. I exported the shell company registration documents from Delaware and Cyprus. I included the fraudulent consulting invoices I uncovered in Chloe's public business registry. Using a data visualization tool, I mapped out the entire laundering network, drawing undeniable lines between Julian's corporate terminal and the offshore routing numbers. I worked tirelessly into the early hours of the morning. My injured fingers throbbed, but I refused to stop until the dossier was absolutely bulletproof. I cross-referenced transaction timestamps with Chloe's social media posts, proving that her massive spending sprees lined up perfectly with the exact days Julian drained the federal grants. It was a masterpiece of forensic data analysis wrapped in military-grade encryption. When the file was finally complete, I leaned back, staring at the flashing cursor on my screen. I possessed the power to utterly destroy them. The question was how to deploy it for maximum impact. My first instinct was to send the encrypted folder to Inspector Hayes. He was already investigating Julian for attempted murder, but I quickly dismissed the thought. Hayes was a good local detective, but a local police department simply didn't have the jurisdiction, the resources, or the forensic accountants to immediately freeze international shell companies and untangle offshore wire fraud. If I handed it to local authorities, Julian's high-priced defense attorneys would stall the process for months with jurisdictional disputes. My parents would easily post bail for a state-level assault charge. They would use their wealth and social influence to muddy the waters, bribe witnesses, and drag out the legal proceedings until I was financially exhausted. I needed a weapon they couldn't buy off. I needed a force of nature that didn't care about their high-society connections or their carefully manufactured public image. Federal wire fraud and international tax evasion were entirely different beasts. When the federal government decides to take you down, they don't just arrest you. They freeze every single bank account tied to your name. They seize your properties. They lock down your assets to the point where you can't even hire a defense attorney without their permission. I opened my secure, untraceable email client, completely bypassing local authorities. I addressed the first message to the special agent in charge of the FBI's white-collar crime division. The second went to the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. I attached the encrypted dossier to both. I didn't write a long emotional plea. I simply provided the decryption keys and a single-sentence overview of a $4.5 million embezzlement and money laundering scheme currently being executed by a senior partner at Apex Realty. I hovered my cursor over the send button. The hotel room was completely silent. Outside the window, Chicago was just beginning to wake up. Chloe had sent me a mocking text earlier, warning me to pack my bags for the psychiatric ward. She thought she was untouchable. She thought she had won. With one decisive click of the mouse, I sent the email. The encrypted data vanished into federal servers, triggering an avalanche they would never see coming. I closed my laptop as a cold, satisfied smile spread across my bruised face. It was time to get ready for my parents' anniversary dinner. The federal servers absorbed the data in absolute silence. There were no blaring sirens, no flashing police lights outside my hotel window. The digital takedown of my brother and sister-in-law was entirely quiet, but the shockwaves were already traveling toward them at the speed of light. My smartphone vibrated violently against the polished mahogany desk, breaking the stillness of my secure suite. I glanced down at the glowing screen. Chloe had sent a new text. "See you in court Monday. Pack your things for the psych ward." I stared at the notification, feeling a strange sense of detachment. Just a few days ago, a threat like that would have sent me into a blind panic. It would have triggered my anxiety and left me desperately scrambling to defend my own sanity. Now it just seemed pathetic. Chloe sat in her luxury Chicago penthouse, completely blinded by her own arrogance, entirely unaware that her entire social media empire was currently being dismantled by federal agents. I didn't reply. I didn't block her. I just swiped left and deleted the conversation for good. Engaging with someone who was already finished was a total waste of time. I needed to prepare for tonight. I picked up the hotel room phone and dialed the premium concierge. I requested an emergency personal shopper, giving them my exact measurements, my corporate credit card, and highly specific wardrobe requirements. 2 hours later, a sleek black garment bag was delivered straight to my suite. I shed my heavy robe and carefully dressed myself. It was a tailored charcoal gray Tom Ford suit, sharp and imposing. It instantly commanded authority, and the structured jacket perfectly concealed the heavy medical bandages wrapped tightly around my cracked ribs. I paired it with a crisp white silk shirt and a pair of leather dress shoes that struck the hardwood floor with the precise click of a clock. I sat at the vanity mirror to fix my appearance. Using high-coverage foundation, I covered the pale, hollow signs of exhaustion on my cheeks and the fading purple bruises along my jawline. But I didn't bother hiding the prominent white gauze on my temple. That gauze wasn't a flaw. It was a visible receipt of my survival, a physical reminder to my entire family of exactly what they had tried to do to me. With my physical armor ready, I turned my attention to my tactical allies. I picked up the phone and dialed Dr. Sterling's private line. She answered on the second ring, her voice as calm and sharp as ever. "Arthur, tell me you're resting." "I'm preparing for battle," I corrected her. "I need an update on Dr. Silas Vance." I heard the satisfying rustle of heavy paperwork on the other end. "The hospital's legal board moved at unprecedented speed," Dr. Sterling confirmed. "Vance made a fatal, arrogant mistake when he signed that involuntary psychiatric hold for your parents. He cited your emergency trauma admission here at our facility, actively falsifying official medical records to back up his fake diagnosis. Our legal team just filed a massive medical fraud complaint with the state licensing board. We've also forwarded the forged evidence directly to the district attorney." I looked at myself in the mirror and smiled. So his career is over. Vance is looking at the immediate revocation of his medical license and serious criminal charges for violating medical privacy laws, Dr. Sterling stated proudly. "Your parents' guardianship petition is dead on arrival. The medical affidavit supporting their entire legal strategy is now classified as fraudulent evidence." "Thank you, Dr. Sterling," I said, a wave of genuine relief washing over my tense shoulders. They thought they could buy a diagnosis with their high society money. They forgot they were dealing with the head of trauma. "Nobody weapons my ER," she replied coldly. "Give them hell tonight, Arthur." I hung up and immediately dialed Inspector Hayes. His gravelly voice instantly came through the speaker. "I hope you're calling to tell me you're in a secure location, Mr. Vance." "I am safe for now, Inspector, but I'm moving locations tonight," I informed him, pacing across the plush carpet. "My parents are hosting their 40th anniversary charity gala at the Field Museum of Natural History tonight. The entire board of Pinnacle Properties will be there. Julian and Chloe are the guests of honor." Inspector Hayes let out a low, warning whistle. "You're walking straight into the lion's den. Julian made his hefty bail, but you have a protection order. I can have a patrol car there in 10 minutes to arrest him for violating it." "Don't send local patrol cars," I instructed calmly. "I want more than a simple violation arrest. I need you on standby, Inspector. Tonight is going to escalate far beyond local jurisdiction." I forwarded a very specific set of financial data to federal authorities early this morning. A long silence fell over the line as Hayes processed the massive implications. You brought in the feds? I brought in the ultimate sanction, I corrected. Julian embezzled $4.5 million from federal grants. Chloe laundered it through her gallery accounts. The FBI and the IRS are already reviewing those routing numbers. The trouble Julian was panicking about in the wine cellar was a mandatory federal audit starting Monday morning. He's a cornered animal. Inspector Hayes let out a short, impressed breath. If the feds are moving on wire fraud of that scale, they won't wait until Monday. To prevent asset destruction and flight risks, they move incredibly fast. I'll coordinate with the local federal field office and lock down the perimeter with my team. We'll let the federal agents take the lead, but I want to be there when they put him in the back of the transport. See you at the museum, Inspector. I ended the call and walked back to the mahogany desk. I unplugged the encrypted flash drive from my laptop and dropped it into a sleek black leather briefcase, along with flawless physical copies of the bank routing numbers, the forged medical affidavit, and the offshore shell company registrations. I snapped the metal clasps shut. The sound echoed through the quiet hotel suite with absolute finality. I grabbed the keys to my rental car and my tailored overcoat. Leaving the suite, I took the secure elevator down to the underground parking garage and got into the waiting vehicle. The Chicago rain had finally stopped, leaving the streets gleaming under the amber streetlights. I placed the leather briefcase carefully on the passenger seat. I was no longer the desperate victim suffocating in the Napa Valley mud. I was the architect of their complete undoing, and I was driving straight to their celebration. My rental car rolled smoothly over the white gravel drive, pulling into the grand circular entrance of the Field Museum. The museum's classical, imposing architecture towered into the pitch-black Chicago night, illuminated by dozens of strategically placed spotlights. A sharply uniformed valet rushed forward to open my door. I handed him the keys, grabbed the sleek leather briefcase from the passenger seat, and stepped into the crisp night air. I walked through the massive double doors of the main entrance, my dress shoes clicking confidently against the polished marble floors. The foyer was a masterclass in quiet generational wealth. Massive floral arrangements overflowing with white orchids sat on antique tables. Passing the coat check, I draped my tailored overcoat over my arm to hide the heavy medical bandages around my cracked ribs, though my charcoal designer suit was more than enough to command the room. At the end of the grand hallway lay the entrance to the main ballroom, Stanley Field Hall. 2 uniformed ushers stood at attention, ready to pull open the heavy oak doors. I gave them a sharp nod. They pulled the handles in unison, revealing the absolute peak of Chicago high society. The ballroom was breathtaking, bathed in the warm golden glow of massive crystal chandeliers. Hundreds of guests in custom tuxedos and floor-length evening gowns were mingling. Servers wove through the crowd carrying silver trays loaded with champagne flutes. At the far end of the room on a raised stage, a highly paid string quartet was flawlessly playing a classical concerto. I immediately recognized several key players in the crowd. The entire board of Pinnacle Properties was present, holding premium scotch and laughing at polite jokes. The wealth gathered in this room was astronomical. I stepped across the threshold. For the first 30 seconds, I was just another late guest. Then, a woman standing near the entrance glanced my way. The champagne glass in her hand froze halfway to her lips. She nudged her husband with her elbow, and his head snapped around to stare at me. The recognition was like a drop of ink falling into a glass of water, spreading rapidly across the ballroom. Chloe had made sure half the country had seen my face, accompanied by a fabricated story about my severe addiction and mental instability. To this elite crowd, I wasn't Arthur, the senior managing auditor. I was the unhinged, dangerous liability who had run out into a storm and tried to blackmail his own brother. The reaction was instantaneous. The polite murmur of high society began to stutter, replaced by a rising tide of sharp, frantic whispering. People visibly backed away, clearing a wide path directly in front of me as if my alleged breakdown were highly contagious. The sudden, unnatural shift in the room's energy caught the attention of the string quartet. The lead violinist lost his footing, his bow scraping against the strings with a sharp, jarring screech. The music came to an awkward, prominent halt. In the suffocating silence that suddenly descended upon the grand ballroom, the sharp click of my dress shoes echoed like gunshots as I walked forward with purpose. At the far end of the room, the crowd parted to reveal my parents. Victor and Eleanor were standing near the main bar with the CEO of Pinnacle Properties. The moment they saw me, all the color drained from their faces. Eleanor's jaw dropped, her perfect upper-class smile instantly shattering. Victor's eyes narrowed into slits of pure, unadulterated fury. They excused themselves from the CEO and marched directly toward me, breaking through the staring crowd with frantic, aggressive strides. They intercepted me right in the center of the ballroom. Eleanor lunged forward and grabbed my arm, her manicured fingers digging viciously into the fabric of my suit sleeve. "What on earth do you think you're doing here?" Eleanor hissed, her voice trembling with suppressed rage as she desperately tried to keep the confrontation quiet enough for polite society. "Turn around and walk out of here right now before you embarrass yourself any further." I easily broke her grip and brushed down the charcoal gray fabric of my sleeve, never breaking eye contact. "I'm not the one who's going to be embarrassed tonight, Mother." Victor took a step closer, using his imposing frame to block my path to the stage. "You've lost your mind, Arthur," he threatened, his voice a low, gravelly growl. "You're legally incompetent. We just filed the emergency temporary guardianship papers this afternoon. If you don't walk out those doors voluntarily in 10 seconds, I will have club security drag you out and put you straight into a transport vehicle for the psychiatric ward." Before I could even break down the complete failure of their legal trap, Julian and Chloe emerged from the crowd. Julian looked incredibly smug, wearing a custom velvet tuxedo jacket and holding a glass of bourbon. He radiated the arrogant confidence of a man convinced he had already won the war. Chloe stood right beside him, her arm looped through his, wearing a deeply sympathetic, highly manufactured look of concern for the benefit of the surrounding audience. Julian glanced down at the sleek leather briefcase gripped tightly in my hand. A greasy, triumphant smirk spread across his face. "Well, well, well," Julian said loudly, making sure the nearby Pinnacle Properties executives heard his magnanimous tone. "Look who finally decided to rejoin reality. Did you bring that signed Napa Vineyard deed with you, Arthur, or are you just here to beg for your allowance back? We told you if you turn over control of the accounts, we'll pay for your treatment center. You don't need to make a scene to get our help." Chloe let out a soft, dramatic sigh. "We just want you to get better, Arthur. Please don't do this to yourself in front of Julian's investors." I looked at my brother, taking in his relaxed posture, his expensive watch, and the absolute certainty in his eyes. He genuinely believed he had successfully buried my life to save his own. I looked at Chloe playing the grieving saint, and at my parents standing like a protective wall in front of their golden child. I didn't raise my voice, I didn't lash out. I just locked eyes with Julian and delivered a calm, entirely emotionless response. "The federal audit into your accounts begins Monday morning, Julian. I just thought I'd save the compliance team some overtime." Julian's arrogant smirk vanished instantly. His eyes darted to the leather briefcase, a sudden terrifying realization flashing in his pupils. I didn't wait for his response. I bypassed my parents entirely, moving right through the narrow gap between them with absolute authority. I walked with purposeful steps toward the raised main stage at the end of the ballroom, leaving my family frozen in the middle of the whispering crowd. I stepped onto the stage, ignoring the string quartet as they confusingly packed up their instruments. Behind the podium was the venue's massive audio-visual console, which was currently looping a slideshow of my parents' 40-year marriage on the giant screens lining the ballroom walls. I placed my leather briefcase on the podium and unclasped the metal locks with a loud, distinct click. I pulled the heavily encrypted titanium flash drive from my inside pocket. Leaning over, I bypassed the venue's standard input and plugged the drive directly into the main projection control system. The romantic montage of my parents instantly disappeared, replaced by the cold, high-contrast interface of my data analysis dashboard. The two massive screens on either side of the ballroom flashed with complex financial flowcharts, bank routing numbers, and offshore corporate registrations. I stepped up to the podium and pulled the microphone close. A sharp, high-pitched ring of audio feedback echoed through the massive space, instantly silencing any remaining whispers. I looked out at the sea of custom tuxedos and designer gowns. My eyes locked directly on the CEO of Pinnacle Properties, who was standing just a few feet away from my frozen, terrified brother. "Good evening," I said, my voice steady and perfectly amplified by the venue's sound system. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Arthur Gallagher. I am the senior managing auditor for a Department of Defense contractor. My sister-in-law recently put out a narrative online claiming that I am suffering from severe delusions. So tonight, I brought the irrefutable data to ensure we are all living in reality. I struck the spacebar on my laptop. The screens behind me zoomed in on a specific project ledger from Pinnacle Properties, displayed side by side with registration documents for a Delaware shell company. Julian Gallagher is a senior partner at Pinnacle Properties, I continued, pacing my words for maximum clarity. Over the past 18 months, he has been executing a highly sophisticated embezzlement operation. He targeted federal grants intended for remote development and systematically drained those funds. He funneled exactly $4.5 million in federal money through a shell entity called Shield Holdings, eventually routing the capital to offshore accounts in Cyprus. The ballroom instantly erupted into a chaotic symphony of gasps and angry shouting. Several Pinnacle Properties executives turned aggressively toward Julian, their faces flushing red with corporate fury. Julian backed away, his hands raised, his arrogant posture completely collapsing. His mouth opened to defend himself, but no sound came out. The evidence hanging above his head was undeniable. The specific routing numbers, transfer dates, and exact amounts matched his project ledgers perfectly. The CEO of Pinnacle Properties pushed through the crowd, pointing a trembling finger straight at Julian's chest, demanding an immediate explanation that my brother was entirely powerless to give. Sensing the rapidly escalating hostility, club security began moving inward from the perimeter. I struck the keyboard again. The screens shifted to the mandatory audit calendar for the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Your firm is scheduled for a mandatory third-party audit this coming Monday morning, I announced, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room. Julian realized the missing $4.5 million would trigger immediate federal wire fraud charges. He needed a massive, untraceable bridge loan to replace the stolen funds before the auditors arrived. To get that loan, he needed half the deed to our late grandfather's Napa Valley vineyard, which is in my name. When I refused to sign it over to him in the tasting room, he spiked my drink to trigger a life-threatening allergic reaction, withheld my emergency medication, watched me go into respiratory distress, took my car keys, and locked me in the cellar to die so he could inherit my assets. My parents completely collapsed into themselves in the middle of the ballroom. Their desperate, carefully orchestrated guardianship trap was now exposed as a frantic cover-up for attempted murder and federal financial crimes. Victor gripped the edge of a cocktail table just to stay upright, his face as white as paper. Eleanor covered her mouth with both hands, staring at the grand screens in pure horror. But embezzlement requires a laundering mechanism, I said, shifting the spotlight to Chloe, who was backing away from Julian, her eyes darting around the room, desperately hunting for an exit. I pressed for the next slide. A waterfall of bank transfers flooded the screens, showing millions of dollars moving directly from Cyprus into her primary business checking accounts. Chloe used her gallery business to launder this stolen federal capital under the guise of fabricated high-end art consulting fees, I explained coldly. Every luxury bag, every lavish trip, and even the gown she is wearing tonight was paid for with federal grants stolen from Pinnacle Properties. She willingly processed stolen capital to maintain a lifestyle they could never afford. Chloe slammed her hands over her face, instantly shifting into her professional victim persona. She let out a loud theatrical wail and dropped to her knees on the marble floor. I had no idea, she shrieked, her voice echoing across the ballroom. Julian lied to me. He handled all the finances. I thought that money was from legitimate art deals. I am a victim here too. Please, you have to believe me. I looked down at her from the stage. The performance was flawless, but data doesn't care about tears. I had already anticipated this move. I never expected you to take accountability, Chloe, I said, my voice dropping to a deadly low register that somehow carried more weight than a shout. Which is why I decrypted the back-end direct messages from your private social media accounts. I pressed enter one final time. The massive screens lit up with high-definition screenshots of Chloe's private chats with a high-profile divorce attorney and her secret offshore financial planner. The timestamps were from just 2 days ago, right after she posted the viral video accusing me of addiction. I read the projected text aloud, ensuring that not a single syllable was lost on anyone in the room. Have Julian's parents move forward with the medical guardianship on Monday, Chloe had written. Once Julian gets Arthur's corporate stock options, have the Cayman accounts ready for the wire. The second the funds clear, file the divorce papers. I am not taking the fall for his mess at Pinnacle Properties. I'm taking the cash and moving to Geneva before the feds raid his office. A collective gasp rippled through the entire ballroom. Chloe's fake weeping stopped instantly. She remained on her knees on the polished marble floor, staring up at the massive screens with absolute naked terror in her eyes. Her carefully constructed socialite persona shattered into a million unfixable pieces right in front of Chicago's most powerful elite. Hanging right above her head was irrefutable proof of her betrayal, exposing her as a coldly calculating accomplice who fully planned to abandon her husband the moment she secured her share of my stolen wealth. The complete collapse of Chloe's online image sent a shockwave of disgust through the ballroom. The crowd's whispers turned into open hostility. Wealthy patrons who had previously fawned over Chloe's aesthetic perfection now glared down at her, recognizing her as an active participant in a systematic theft of funds. But Victor and Eleanor weren't finished yet. Desperation is a powerful motivator, and they had spent a lifetime protecting their golden child at all costs. Victor left his trembling wife, squaring his shoulders in a frantic, last-ditch effort to regain control of the narrative. He pointed a shaking finger at the stage. "Do not listen to a single word he says," Victor shouted, his voice echoing as he tried to drown out the rising fury in the room. "My son is deeply unwell and highly delusional. He ran out into a storm in a state of complete mental breakdown. We filed for emergency medical guardianship this afternoon because he is suffering from severe paranoia and inventing these ridiculous financial conspiracies." The CEO of Pinnacle Properties turned to Victor, his expression a mix of profound skepticism and pure corporate rage. "Delusional? The offshore routing numbers he just projected match your son's project ledgers perfectly, Victor. Are you telling me he imagined a Delaware shell company?" "He hacked into Julian's terminal," Eleanor chimed in, her voice shrill and desperate as she rushed to her husband's side. "He's an auditor. He altered that data to frame Julian because he's always been jealous of him. Our psychiatrist has already confirmed he is completely detached from reality. We have the legal filings to prove it." I watched them scramble, their lies becoming more frantic and reckless by the second. They were doubling down on the medical guardianship, counting on high society's deep-seated prejudice, the belief that a wealthy, respectable family would only take such extreme legal action out of genuine concern for a sick relative. They needed the crowd to believe I was crazy, because if I was sane, they were all going to federal prison. It was time to dismantle their final trap. I reached back into the leather briefcase resting on the podium and pulled out a thick stack of heavy cardstock. It wasn't a spreadsheet or a routing number. It was a formal legal complaint bearing the official embossed seal of the State Medical Licensing Board. "Are you referring to Dr. Silas Vance?" I asked, my voice calm, completely lacking the hysteria they were trying to project onto me. "The high-priced psychiatrist you hired to sign off on a guardianship application without ever evaluating me?" Victor scoffed, trying to maintain his authoritative posture. "Dr. Vance is a highly respected professional. His assessment is valid." "No, it isn't," I replied, holding up the documents for the entire ballroom to see. I tapped the spacebar on my laptop. The screens behind me shifted from the financial data to a high-resolution scan of the medical fraud complaint. The names were clearly legible, and the allegations were devastating. "Dr. Vance made a catastrophic mistake," I announced to the silent room. He cited my emergency trauma admission in San Francisco in his affidavit. What he didn't know is that I was admitted under the direct care of Dr. Sterling, the chief of trauma at San Francisco General, and Dr. Sterling has zero tolerance for medical fraud in her hospital. I looked directly at my parents. The color drained completely from their faces as the severity of their miscalculation set in. Less than an hour ago, the hospital's legal team initiated major federal charges against Dr. Vance, I continued, making sure every word carried to the back of the room. He actively falsified official hospital records and committed a severe violation of medical privacy laws to back up your fake diagnosis. He has been suspended from practice effective immediately, pending a full criminal investigation. The crowd gasped. The executives from Pinnacle Properties exchanged dark, calculating looks. The narrative had completely flipped. I wasn't the delusional addict. My family was a white-collar crime ring operating under a high society veneer. "And it gets worse for you," I added, dropping my voice to a deadly quiet frequency that somehow carried more weight than a shout. When the hospital's legal team confronted Dr. Vance with the high-definition security footage of Julian watching me go into respiratory distress and locking the door to leave me there, the doctor broke instantly. He gave everything to the medical board. He confessed that Victor and Eleanor Gallagher paid him $100,000 to fabricate the psychiatric evaluation. Dead silence fell over the ballroom. Through the microphone, the ragged breathing of my horrified family was clearly audible. "You weren't just trying to strip me of my independence," I said, locking eyes with my terrified father. "You committed conspiracy to commit medical fraud. You bribed a licensed physician to lie to a federal judge. Your emergency guardianship petition is completely dead." Victor stumbled backward, knocking over a cocktail table. A glass shattered against the marble floor, the sharp sound cutting through the tension in the room. Eleanor let out a low, terrified whimper, clutching her designer bag to her chest as if it could protect her from the legal fallout heading their way. They were completely exposed. The pristine, aristocratic image they had spent 40 years maintaining was utterly ruined. They were no longer the respected elite. They were accomplices in a multi-million-dollar embezzlement and fraud operation. Julian, who had been standing frozen near the stage, suddenly snapped out of his shock. He looked at the screens, looked at his parents, and realized the walls were closing in fast. His expensive lawyers couldn't save him from federal routing numbers, and his parents' money could no longer buy a fraudulent diagnosis. "You're lying!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking with pure, unadulterated desperation. He pointed a trembling finger at me. "You can't prove any of this. It's all fabricated data. I'm leaving." He turned and bolted toward the grand double oak doors of the ballroom, abandoning his parents, abandoning his wife on the floor, focusing entirely on his own survival. He was going to run. But he didn't even make it out the door. Julian lunged for the heavy brass handles of the massive oak doors, his custom velvet tuxedo jacket twisting out of shape at the shoulders from his frantic movements. The elite guests of the Field Museum scrambled out of his path, dropping champagne flutes and appetizers. They no longer saw him as a respected financial executive or a high society favorite. They saw a deeply dangerous, cornered fugitive. He reached out his hands, desperate to throw open the heavy doors and escape into the cold Chicago night. He never even touched the polished brass. The massive oak doors flew inward with a violent, explosive force, throwing Julian backward several feet. A flood of individuals wearing dark tactical windbreakers with bright yellow FBI lettering, emblazoned across the back, poured into the grand ballroom. This wasn't local patrol handling a minor domestic dispute. This was a precisely executed, large-scale, high-level federal raid. A dozen armed agents fanned out across the marble floor, securing every exit and instantly taking absolute control of the room. The special agent in charge, a tall, grim-faced man, stepped through the threshold, his commanding voice easily cutting through the venue's expensive audio system. "FBI, nobody move!" The Pinnacle Properties executives immediately threw their hands up and stepped back, physically distancing themselves from Julian as much as humanly possible. The CEO of the firm completely turned his back on my brother, his mind already racing with the public relations nightmare his company was about to face. The second federal badges appeared. Corporate loyalty vanished. Julian froze in the center of the room, completely surrounded by federal agents. His chest heaved as he looked around the opulent ballroom in sheer terror, realizing every single escape route had been completely cut off. The data packet I had sent to federal authorities early that morning had mapped out his entire life, leaving him nowhere left to hide. In a final, incredibly foolish burst of desperate energy, he dropped his shoulder and tried to push past the nearest agent, attempting to break for the lobby corridor. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. The federal agent didn't hesitate for even half a second. He grabbed Julian by the lapels of his expensive custom tuxedo, swept his legs, and slammed my brother face down onto the polished marble floor with a heavy, sickening thud. Two more agents immediately descended on him, pinning his arms back with absolute authority. Julian struggled wildly against the cold stone, his perfectly styled hair now a chaotic, sweat-soaked disaster. He screamed that this was all a massive misunderstanding, begging our parents to do something, pleading with them to call their high-priced attorneys right that second. Victor and Eleanor just stood there, completely paralyzed by the epic nightmare unfolding right in front of their wealthy peers. The elite social mask they had spent 40 years meticulously crafting was being ruthlessly torched. They couldn't bribe a federal agent. They couldn't charm their way out of an FBI raid. They were entirely powerless, forced to watch the brutal reality of enabling a criminal catch up to them in real time. The sharp, heavy click of federal handcuffs echoed loudly through the ballroom, signaling a brilliant, undeniable end. I stood at the podium, looking down at everything from the stage. I watched the golden child of the Gallagher family get hauled up from the floor, his designer suit ruined, his dignity completely stripped away. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a volatile mix of hatred and absolute terror. I didn't flinch. I didn't offer a sympathetic smile. I just stared back with the cold, precise gaze of a data analyst who had successfully isolated and eliminated a toxic anomaly. While the room's attention was completely locked on Julian, who was breaking down in tears as his rights were read to him, my data-driven eyes swept the perimeter of the room. Chloe was no longer kneeling where her social empire had just collapsed. Using the chaotic distraction of the raid, she had dropped to the floor and was military crawling behind a long row of linen-draped cocktail tables, completely abandoning her husband for self-preservation. I watched her stand up in the deep shadows near the catering corridor, clutching her designer bag tightly against her chest. She began to slip toward the double-sided swinging doors leading to the commercial kitchen. She actually thought she was being clever. She genuinely believed her social media maneuvering could outsmart the federal government. She thought she could slip out the back, hop on a plane to Geneva, and live happily ever after on my stolen inheritance and the leverage from the Napa vineyard. I leaned into the microphone, my voice cutting sharply through the commotion. "Agents, you might want to check the service corridor exit," I announced. "The money launderer is trying to run." Before the FBI agents could even reach the catering hallway, the heavy swinging doors burst open from the outside, and Chloe stumbled backward into the bright lights of the ballroom, her face a mask of pure panic. Stepping through the doors right behind her was a sharp-eyed woman in a crisp gray suit, holding a massive, heavy stack of legal documents. The gold badge clipped to her belt didn't say FBI. It read, IRS, Criminal Investigation. The federal agent stepped firmly into Chloe's path, cutting off any hope of retreat. "Chloe Gallagher," the agent stated, her voice slicing through what was left of the tension in the room. "You have been formally served with a federal indictment for massive tax evasion, wire fraud, and international money laundering. We have frozen all of your domestic and offshore accounts. Your passport has been flagged, and your assets are officially seized." The agent pressed the heavy stack of documents directly against Chloe's chest. Chloe stared blankly at the legal paperwork as the reality of absolute financial ruin finally hit her. She had no followers to save her. She had no offshore accounts to flee to. The designer clothes on her back and the expensive bag she was clutching were now property of the United States government. She looked over at Julian, who was struggling in his handcuffs, and then slowly raised her eyes to meet mine on the stage. The trap had closed perfectly. The heavy stack of federal indictments slipped from Chloe's manicured hands, scattering across the polished marble floor of the catering corridor. She didn't even try to pick them up. The IRS agent simply placed a firm hand on her shoulder and guided her forward to join her husband. The federal agents marched Julian and Chloe straight down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, parading them past the stunned faces of Chicago's highest social echelon. Executives from Apex Realty actively turned their backs on my handcuffed brother as he was led away. The room was deathly quiet, broken only by the crisp, authoritative commands of the federal agents and the heavy thud of their tactical boots. I calmly unplugged the encrypted titanium flash drive from the venue's projection system and slid it back into my sleek leather briefcase. I closed my laptop, the screen going dark, marking the end of the most devastating presentation of my entire auditing career. I walked down the short steps of the stage, passing right by my completely paralyzed parents without giving them a single glance. Victor and Eleanor were rooted to the floor, pale and breathing heavily. They had spent a lifetime cultivating an untouchable sense of upper-class superiority, and I had just burned it to ash in less than 20 minutes. I walked out through the massive double doors of the ballroom, retrieved my tailored overcoat from the valet, and drove back to the security of my hotel suite. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic. By Monday morning, the local news had completely dropped the narrative about my alleged mental breakdown. The digital files I had handed over to federal authorities provided such irrefutable proof that the financial news networks picked up the story instantly. Julian's face was plastered across every major news channel, right next to staggering charts detailing his $4.5 million embezzlement scheme. The board of Apex Realty issued a freezing public statement, severing all ties with him and stating they were cooperating fully with the FBI to audit every single account he had ever touched. Chloe's digital empire dismantled at a speed that defied modern social media metrics. The moment the tax evasion and money laundering charges went public, her massive online community turned on her with a vengeance. The very followers she had weaponized against me just days prior were now flooding her comments section with absolute venom. Major luxury brands and art institutions terminated her lucrative contracts within hours, citing severe violations of their corporate ethics clauses. Several companies immediately filed massive civil lawsuits demanding the return of upfront endorsement advances. Facing complete financial destruction and a tsunami of litigation, Chloe tried to protect what was left of her assets by rushing to file for bankruptcy. It was a desperate, foolish move. You cannot protect funds obtained through federal wire fraud by declaring bankruptcy. The IRS Criminal Investigation Division moved with ruthless efficiency, padlocking her penthouse, freezing her domestic bank accounts, and seizing every single designer bag, watch, and vehicle purchased with the stolen federal infrastructure funds. She was left with absolutely nothing but the clothes she wore to federal court. The legal reality facing Julian was significantly worse. On Tuesday afternoon, I watched his federal bail hearing via a secure digital feed provided by Inspector Hayes. Julian sat at the defense table in a standard bright jail jumpsuit, a jarring contrast to the tailored suits he usually favored. His high-priced defense attorney argued passionately for his release, citing his deep ties to the community and his lack of a prior criminal record. The federal prosecutor simply stood up and projected the exact same back-end direct message screenshots I had displayed at the museum gala. The messages explicitly outlined Chloe's plan to wire the stolen funds to the Cayman Islands and flee to Geneva the moment the money cleared. The prosecutor argued that Julian had access to offshore routing networks and clearly possessed the capital required to flee international jurisdiction. The federal judge didn't even hesitate. She brought her gavel down with a resounding crack, deeming my brother an extreme flight risk. Bail was flatly denied. Julian buried his face in his trembling hands as he was remanded directly to a federal detention facility to await trial. As Julian and Chloe collided with the federal justice system, the shockwaves of their criminal operation slammed heavily into Victor and Eleanor. My parents had spent years blindly enabling Julian, bailing him out of his failures and funding his arrogant lifestyle to protect the family image. But their blind loyalty contained a massive, fatal flaw. 2 years ago, when Julian first started experiencing severe cash flow issues before turning to direct embezzlement, he had begged them for a massive injection of capital to keep up appearances. Victor, desperate to maintain the image of his golden boy son being a success, had signed as a guarantor on multiple high-interest commercial loans for Julian's fraudulent shell companies. He had leveraged his own massive investment portfolio and the significant equity in their primary estate to secure the debt. When the FBI and IRS tracked the intricate web of offshore accounts, the financial trail led directly to my father's signature. In a massive fraud syndicate case, the federal government does not differentiate between the mastermind and the financial guarantor. Authorities immediately flagged Victor and Eleanor's accounts as being heavily intertwined with stolen federal assets. Emergency injunctions were issued by the court to prevent the destruction of evidence or the hiding of capital. On Wednesday afternoon, completely oblivious to the financial apocalypse heading their way, Victor and Eleanor tried to seek refuge in the only place they thought they still commanded respect. They took their luxury sedan to an exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant near the Field Museum, hoping to hide out in a private dining room and spin a victim narrative to their wealthy friends. Tommen steps into the elegant dining room with their heads held high, desperately pretending the gala raid was just a massive misunderstanding that their lawyers would resolve shortly. They ordered an incredibly lavish lunch, sipping expensive wine and ignoring the harsh, scrutinizing stares from other patrons. When the bill arrived, Victor confidently slid his heavy black Premier credit card from his wallet and placed it on the silver tray. The waiter bowed slightly and turned to process the payment. 5 minutes later, the restaurant manager approached their table. He wasn't holding a receipt. Instead, he wore an expression of cold, polite disdain. He placed the black card back onto the pristine white tablecloth. Leaning down, the manager informed them that the card had been declined. Flushing red with sudden anger, Victor pulled out 2 backup premium cards, insisting there was a mistake with the banking network. The manager ran both cards. Immediate declines. The federal asset freeze had taken absolute paralyzing effect. Every single penny they owned was locked down tight by the United States government. The manager looked at my parents and, in a voice that carried clearly across the quiet, eavesdropping restaurant, firmly requested that they leave immediately. The sheer humiliation of being escorted out of the establishment under the mocking gazes of their former peers was just the very beginning of their rapid descent into total ruin. 3 weeks passed. My own career trajectory moved in the exact opposite direction. Marcus, the CEO of my firm, reviewed every single page of the bulletproof, mathematically flawless data file I used to blow the whistle on Julian's federal wire fraud. Not only did he immediately lift my unpaid administrative leave, but he also fired the executives who had questioned my integrity and promoted me to chief compliance officer on the spot. Now I occupy a massive corner office on the 40th floor of a downtown Chicago skyscraper, wrapped in floor-to-ceiling soundproof glass. My desk is a sleek slab of polished stone overlooking Lake Michigan. I've rebuilt my fortress, and this time the walls are completely impenetrable. I was right in the middle of reviewing a quarterly data audit when the sleek phone on my desk rang. My executive assistant spoke through the intercom, her voice laced with deep hesitation. She told me my parents were standing in the main lobby downstairs. They had forced their way past the security desk by closely tailing a group of couriers. Now they were demanding to see me, claiming it was a severe family emergency. A month ago, just hearing about their presence would have sent my heart racing with anxiety. Today, my pulse remained completely flat. I even checked the vitals on my smartwatch just to confirm. A perfect, resting heart rate. I instructed my assistant to issue them temporary visitor badges and escort them directly up to my office. I wanted to see exactly what desperation looked like on the faces of people who once thought they owned the world. When the heavy glass door of my office slid open, I barely recognized the 2 people who stepped over the threshold. That immaculate, elite aura was entirely gone. Victor wore a suit that looked at least 2 sizes too big, a clear sign of the rapid weight loss brought on by the immense pressure of the federal investigation. His usually perfectly groomed silver hair was now disheveled and thinning significantly. Eleanor looked hollowed out. She carried a generic canvas tote bag instead of her usual designer purse, and her hurried, uneven makeup couldn't hide the deep, dark circles under her eyes. They looked like 2 panicked, drowning animals. I didn't stand up to greet them. I didn't offer them a seat. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossed my hands over the polished stone surface of my desk, and waited for them to speak first. Victor cleared his throat, shifting his weight uncomfortably under my cold, analytical stare. "Arthur," he began, his voice completely stripped of its old, booming authority. "We know we have no right to be here. We know you're angry, but we literally have nowhere else to go." Eleanor stepped forward, clutching the cheap tote bag against her chest like a flotation device. "The federal government took everything," she whimpered, her voice trembling with raw, unfiltered panic. "They froze our retirement accounts. They locked our checking accounts. Every time we try to buy groceries, the transaction gets flagged by the IRS, and the bank just issued a formal foreclosure notice on the house." I stared at her in absolute silence. The data calculated perfectly in my mind. They had guaranteed Julian's fraudulent loans, tying their entire net worth to a criminal enterprise. The federal asset freeze was working exactly as designed. "We're going to be on the street by the end of the month," Victor pleaded, taking a desperate step closer to my desk. "Julian is sitting in a federal holding cell. Before he went in, his defense team drained the last bit of clean cash we had left. We have nothing, Arthur. We came to ask if you could give us a personal loan. Just enough to rent a small apartment and cover basic legal counsel so we can untangle ourselves from your brother's mess." The sheer audacity of the request hung in the quiet, climate-controlled air of my office. They were asking the very son they tried to forcibly lock away in a psychiatric facility to fund their legal defense against the consequences of their own enabling. Eleanor let out a ragged sob, reaching a trembling hand toward the edge of my desk. "Please, Arthur, you're sitting in this massive corner office. You clearly have the resources. We're family. You can't just throw your own flesh and blood out on the street to suffer. In times of crisis, family helps family." I leaned forward slowly, resting my elbows on the stone surface. Hearing the word family come out of her mouth, with all its supreme hypocrisy, was the final piece of perfect data I needed to close this chapter for good. "You want to talk about a family crisis?" I said, dropping my voice to a lethal undertone that made both of them visibly flinch. "Let's review the data. Mother, just a few weeks ago, your golden child locked me in a freezing basement. He stole my keys, he poisoned my drink and watched me suffocate from a severe allergic reaction. He literally stepped right over my gasping body just to save his own bank accounts. Victor swallowed hard, looking down at his worn shoes. We didn't know the whole truth at the time. We were just trying to protect him. You knew exactly what you were doing, I countered instantly, cutting through his pathetic excuse. When a truck driver saved my life and ruined his plan, you both stormed into my ICU room. You didn't ask if I could breathe on my own. You demanded that I drop the charges because my survival caused you social embarrassment at the museum gala. You hired a corrupt psychiatrist to have me declared legally incompetent. You tried to seize my assets and commit me to an asylum so your son could use my corporate stock options to pay off his fraudulent federal debts. Eleanor wiped a tear from her cheek, her face contorting with desperate grief. We made a horrible mistake. We were blinded by panic. But you've won, Arthur. You exposed everything. You have your career back. You have so much money. We are begging you for mercy. The variable for mercy no longer exists in the algorithm evaluating the two of you, I replied coldly. You made a calculated statistical choice to sacrifice my life and my freedom to protect a criminal. Now you get to experience the exact same amount of compassion you showed me when you left me to suffocate in that wine cellar. Victor's face crumbled as the absolute finality of my words set in. Arthur, please. We took the bus here because we couldn't even afford gas. How are we supposed to get home? How are we supposed to survive this week? I looked at the two people who had spent my entire life treating me like a disposable asset. I reached out and calmly pressed the security button hidden beneath the rim of my desk. I'm sorry, but my funds are tied up at the moment, I said, perfectly extracting all emotion from my voice. Why don't you try ride-sharing? The heavy glass door behind them immediately swung open. Two large, imposing corporate security guards stepped into my office, their expressions stern and uncompromising. Moving with efficient precision, they flanked my parents and directed them toward the service elevators. Victor and Eleanor didn't fight it, their last remaining ounce of pride completely stripped away. I watched through the soundproof glass as security escorted them out of my fortress and down the hallway, out into the total ruin they had built for themselves. The data-driven real estate attorney tapped his finger against the top of the crisp white document resting on my polished stone desk. It was the final closing paperwork for the Napa Valley vineyard. Exactly 2 days had passed since I had security remove my parents from my office, and this stack of papers represented the very last physical tie to my toxic bloodline. The buyer was a massive commercial developer planning to bulldoze the historic timber structures to build an ultra-luxury resort. I felt no nostalgia whatsoever about the impending demolition. That wine cellar wasn't a place of happy childhood memories. It was a crime scene. It was a cold stage where my own brother had precisely calculated the value of my life and found it worthless. I picked up my expensive titanium pen. The weight of it felt solid and reassuring in my hand. I flipped to the signature line on the property deed. This was the exact document Julian had slammed against my chest on that stormy night, trying to force my compliance. He had tried to claim this signature through force, intimidation, and a chilling willingness to let me suffocate. I pressed the pen to the paper, signing my name in a smooth, unbroken stroke. The transaction was finalized with the drop of a notary stamp and a firm handshake. Within 4 hours, a massive wire transfer cleared into my secondary banking portal. The millions of dollars from the sale of the vineyard were instantly diversified into secure, high-yield municipal bonds and a hardware upgrade for my firm's back-end auditing servers. I had successfully liquidated the past. The financial and legal severance from the Gallagher legacy was absolute. I no longer co-owned a single thing with them. I owed them nothing. The gears of the federal judiciary turned much slower than a real estate transaction, but their destination was absolutely inevitable. 6 months after I signed away the Napa vineyard, my brother's federal trial came to its final conclusion. I sat in my newly purchased high-security Chicago penthouse. Rain tapped against the reinforced glass windows in a gentle, comforting rhythm. I poured myself a glass of expensive red wine and used my smart remote to power on the massive television mounted in the living room. I tuned the channel to the local evening news. I wasn't watching out of anxiety, I was watching because I enjoy seeing a dataset reach its logical, verified conclusion. The news anchor appeared on screen, her expression somber as the graphics behind her displayed Julian's prison mugshot, next to an imposing FBI seal. A former senior partner at Apex Realty was sentenced in federal court today following a massive, multi-million-dollar embezzlement scandal. the anchor reported clearly. Julian Gallagher, 41, was handed a mandatory 10-year sentence in a federal penitentiary. The sentence covers massive wire fraud, international money laundering, and an additional conviction for reckless endangerment stemming from a targeted incident in California earlier this year. The broadcast cut to live footage outside the federal courthouse. The heavy glass doors pushed open, and Julian was led out by two heavily armed U.S. Marshals. He wore a standard, loose-fitting khaki jumpsuit, his hands locked in heavy chains at his waist. He looked like a completely different person from the arrogant golden child in the custom tuxedo who had mocked me at the charity gala. His face was gaunt, his posture entirely defeated, his eyes darting nervously past the flashing cameras before dropping to the concrete ground. He looked like a man who had finally realized his privilege couldn't buy a pardon. The news anchor continued her report, detailing the secondary fallout of the investigation. Federal prosecutors confirmed that Gallagher's wife, a former high-end art broker, accepted a binding plea agreement, granting the IRS full access to their offshore routing networks. While she avoids federal prison time, she faces total asset forfeiture, catastrophic financial penalties, and a lifetime ban from serving in any corporate, fiduciary, or financial capacity. Chloe had done exactly what her back-end direct messages predicted. The very second the federal trap closed, she viciously betrayed her husband for self-preservation, trading his freedom for a lighter sentence. There is no loyalty among thieves, and there is certainly none among narcissists. The news segment concluded with a brief mention of the unindicted co-conspirators. Although Victor and Eleanor escaped formal criminal charges due to a lack of evidence tying them directly to the wire fraud, civil asset forfeiture completely demolished their fortune. They currently reside in a low-income housing community dozens of miles outside the city, completely exiled from the high society that once defined their entire existence. They haven't attempted to contact me since the day my security team escorted them out of my office. The boundaries I built are rock solid. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. I analyzed my internal metrics, searching for any lingering family grief, sudden guilt, or even a rush of vengeful satisfaction. I found nothing. My emotional dashboard was completely neutral. Julian was facing a decade in a federal cell. My parents were living in the poverty they once deeply despised. Chloe was a disgraced, bankrupt outcast. This wasn't a tragedy. This was simply the natural mathematical result of the toxic variables they chose to introduce. I picked up the remote and pressed the power button. The television screen went black, cutting off the courthouse footage and silencing the anchor's voice. The quiet in my penthouse wasn't the suffocating, heavy silence of the Napa Vineyard cellar. It was a warm, secure quiet, the kind of life I built completely on my own terms. I set my glass on the coffee table and walked toward the spacious bedroom. It was time to prepare for the evening. Opening my custom closet, I bypassed the sharp, tailored business suits I usually wear into corporate battle. Tonight required a different aesthetic. I pulled out a soft, elegant cashmere sweater and a pair of fitted trousers. I wasn't preparing for a fight. I wasn't heading to a toxic country club gathering or a sterile hospital room. Checking my reflection in the mirror, I noticed the scar near my temple had faded to an almost invisible silver line. I smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that actually reached my eyes. Grabbing my keys from the entryway table, I went to finish setting up the dining room. I was preparing for a dinner party I actually wanted to attend. The heavy oak table was set meticulously. I arranged the place settings with the exact same attention to precision I use in defense data modeling. Crisp linen napkins, polished silverware, and tall crystal stemware gleamed under the warm amber glow of the modern chandelier. The rich aroma of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and caramelized root vegetables drifted from the chef's kitchen, filling my high-security Chicago penthouse with overwhelming warmth. Tonight was Thanksgiving. For the first 32 years of my life, this holiday was an exhausting, highly manipulated performance. It meant wearing uncomfortable clothes, sitting at a freezing museum charity table, and silently enduring my mother's aggressive critiques, while my father loudly boasted about Julian's fraudulent financial victories. It was an annual exercise in emotional survival. But today, the guest list was completely under my control. The biometric doorbell chimed softly in the hallway, signaling an arrival at the front door. Checking the high-definition monitor on the wall, I saw Inspector Hayes standing under the awning, wearing a heavy wool overcoat and holding a premium bottle of aged bourbon. I touched the glass screen to unlock the door. Hayes stepped into the entryway, bringing a crisp gust of late autumn air with him. He handed me the bourbon with a respectful nod. He was off the clock, having traded his wrinkled gray detective suit for a comfortable dark sweater. Tonight, we didn't need to discuss court dates, federal subpoenas, or attempted murder charges. The case was closed. The files were sealed. He was here simply as a trusted ally. Less than 10 minutes later, the security chime rang again. Dr. Sterling walked in, looking stunning in a beautifully tailored burgundy dress that was a dramatic departure from her usual spotless lab coat. She brought a massive, intricately decorated artisanal pie from a high-end local bakery. As she greeted me, her sharp, intelligent eyes briefly scanned my face and posture, a professional habit left over from our time in the ICU. After confirming there were no signs of oxygen deprivation, trauma, or distress, her clinical gaze softened into a warm, genuine smile. My CEO, Marcus, arrived shortly after with his husband. They brought an incredibly rare vintage red wine to celebrate my recent promotion to Chief Compliance Officer. The core of my data analysis team filled out the rest of the guest list. These were brilliant, fiercely loyal colleagues. They had seamlessly managed my corporate duties while I fought for my life in the hospital, and they had actively assisted me in locking down our company's security architecture when my family launched their malicious legal attacks. We gathered around the massive table. There were no assigned seats based on social hierarchy. There was no desperate competition for approval. The conversation flowed easily, engaging, and entirely authentic. We debated predictive medical algorithms, discussed the latest developments in the Chicago tech sector, and shared stories that brought out loud, uninhibited laughter. No one put down another person to inflate their own ego. No one was quietly plotting a financial takeover. Sitting at the head of the table, I slowly savored the expensive red wine Marcus had poured. I allowed my analytical mind to process the scene before me. I looked at Dr. Sterling, the woman who had stood between me and a fraudulent psychiatric hold, using her immense medical authority to protect my vulnerability. I looked at Inspector Hayes, the man who never treated my survival as an inconvenience, but as a crusade for absolute justice. I looked at Marcus and my team, professionals who valued my intellect and integrity above all else. This was my family. The data was irrefutable. Blood relation is nothing more than a genetic lottery, a random assignment of shared DNA that guarantees absolutely nothing when it comes to loyalty, compassion, or safety. True family is a conscious, active choice. It is a network built on verified trust, mutual respect, and undeniable evidence of character. When the system crashed, these were the people who stepped up. When my own flesh and blood tried to bury me in lies, these were the people who chose to believe my data. A sudden, sharp drop in the outside temperature caught my attention. I turned my head toward the expansive floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass windows at the back of the dining room. The Chicago rain had quietly transitioned. Heavy, massive white flakes began to fall from the dark night sky, swirling gently in the glow of the backyard security lights. Once, a nut allergy and a dark basement were the ultimate enemies, and freezing mud had almost become my grave. For months during my recovery, even a hint of nuts in a wine glass or a dim, cramped space would cause my heart rate to spike. But now, as I watched the snow slowly blanket the lush evergreens in my private garden, my airway didn't constrict. My respiratory tract remained perfectly open. My resting pulse stayed absolutely calm. I was safe, I was highly successful, and I was surrounded by a fortress of genuine love. The conversation at the table naturally quieted down as my guests noticed me looking out the window. Dr. Sterling watched the falling snow, then looked back at me, a profound understanding passing between us. She raised her glass slightly, a silent, deeply respectful acknowledgement of the battle we had won together. I stood up from my chair, the movement fluid and free of pain. My ribs were completely healed, my strength fully restored. I picked up my crystal wine glass and extended it toward the center of the table. "To systems that remain unbroken when tested," I said, my voice clear, steady, and resonating with absolute peace. "And to the people who build them." The guests raised their glasses in unison, the crisp, sharp ring of clinking crystal echoing through the warm penthouse. I took a final sip of the rich red wine and looked back out the window. The snow continued to fall, draping the city in a clean, brilliant blanket of white. It was no longer a symbol of isolation or betrayal. It was simply a beautiful, quiet reminder that the storm had completely passed, leaving a perfect foundation for a new beginning. The profound lesson from this story is that true family is defined by actions, not just biology. When the people who are supposed to protect you repeatedly choose to sacrifice your well-being for their own comfort, wealth, or image, walking away is not an act of cruelty. It is necessary self-preservation. Shared DNA does not give anyone the right to destroy your peace of mind. True family is built on mutual respect, unwavering sacrifice, and showing up when it matters most. You have every right to protect your boundaries and walk away from conditional love. Share your own experiences with setting healthy boundaries and leave a comment below.